The crossing 1620 to 1630, the wind howled across the gray Atlantic, its breath sharp as a knife, lashing salt spray against the wooden boards of the ship. The vessel groaned and creaked as though alive, as though it, too, suffered the strain of the endless sea. Among the cramped lower decks, where light rarely reached, and the stench of sickness hung heavy, the Whitfield family huddled together to moss. His wife Margaret, and their 3 children, seeking warmth not only from their ragged blankets, but from one another's touch. They had left behind the familiar lanes of England, the old stone church, the marketplace, and the graves of their ancestors. Ahead of them lay nothing but uncertainty. A wilderness whispered about in fearful tones, a land of harsh winters, strange people, and unknown God's will. Yet for Thomas, the choice had been clear. In England, their lives were bounded by rule and hierarchy, faith constrained by the king's decrees, and hope for prosperity dimmed by rigid class. In America, they had been told one could worship freely till one's own land, raise children under no lord's whip, and perhaps even shape a new future. That dream, distant as the horizon, had been enough to cast them across the sea. The voyage was not kind. Weeks turned to months, and the sea was merciless. Storms battered the ship, tearing sails and snapping ropes like threads. Men prayed loudly in the hold as thunder rolled and waves lifted the vessel high, only to plunge it down again into black troughs that threatened to swallow it whole. Margaret whispered psalms into her children's ears, her hands trembling though she tried to hide her fear. The youngest, Anne, no more than 4 years old, asked if the sea was God's punishment. And Thomas, voice hoarse with exhaustion, told her that no, it was God's testing ground, a trial before the reward. Hunger gnawed at them. Provisions had spoiled. Salted meat rotted, biscuits molded, water barrels stank. Dysentery spread among the passengers, and death was a constant companion. A boy from the next family fell ill and did not rise. His small body was wrapped in cloth and with solemn prayers slid into the sea. The splash echoed in silence, each parent gripping their own children tighter, knowing fate might claim them next. Margaret clutched in his thin frame and prayed feverishly for strength.
Atlantic
Showed no mercy, yet it also revealed resilience. At night, when the storm eased, Thomas would climb above deck, where the stars stretched across the sky in unbroken brilliance. Brighter than he had ever seen in England's smoke-stained heavens. He thought of how those stars had guided men since the days of Abraham, how they now guided him toward a destiny beyond the king's reach. He promised himself that if his family survived, they would plant their own orchard in the New World, an orchard that would outlive storms, hunger, and tyranny. Weeks later, land was sighted. Shout rose from the deck, wild and desperate, as if the word itself carried salvation. Land. Its men, women, and children surged upward to see the distant dark line on the horizon. Some wept openly, others fell to their knees in prayer. Margaret squeezed Thomas's hand, her face streaked with tears. It was not the England they had known, nor the paradise they had imagined, but it was soil, rock, tree, beyond the endless water, and that was enough. When at last they anchored near the New England coast, fear mingled with hope. The shoreline stretched raw and unbroken, forests pressing down to the waves, smoke rising faintly from native fires. The Whitfields, like the others, did not step ashore with triumph, but with trembling. They knew they had not reached safety, but merely exchanged one danger for another. Winter descended swiftly. The crude shelters offered little protection against the biting cold. Snow piled against walls, and food stores dwindled to scraps. Scurvy swelled gums and blackened teeth. Fever claimed the weak. Margaret nursed Anne through nights of coughing, while Thomas trapped what game he could, though the forests seemed vast and silent, filled with eyes that watched but never showed themselves. Yet amidst the suffering, bonds were forged. Families shared what little they had. Neighbors became kin, and strangers prayed together as if one blood. When spring thawed the earth, when green pushed through snow, and rivers surged again, they planted. Corn, beans, squash seeds borrowed from native allies who taught them what the soil would yield. The first harvest was small, but enough to feed hope. The Whitfields carved a home from the wilderness, logs hewn by Thomas's axe. A chimney built stone by stone, smoke rising steady into the sky. Margaret spun wool, baked bread from coarse meal, and taught her children letters from the Bible. On Sundays, they gathered with the settlement to sing hymns that echoed across the clearing, voices trembling but unbroken. The years brought more trials, raids from hostile tribes, sickness that swept through the town, lean harvests that threatened starvation. But the family endured, burying some of their children and raising others, planting more each spring, cutting deeper into the forest. By 1630, a decade since their desperate voyage, the Whitfields were no longer strangers. They were Americans, though the word was not yet common-rooted in a land that had tested their every weakness and demanded every strength. Thomas's orchard, the one he had vowed under the stars, bore its first apples. Margaret pressed them into cider and shared them with neighbors at the harvest feast. A symbol that from hardship came sweetness, from struggle came endurance, and in the laughter of their children, in the crackle of firewood within their humble cabin, they felt a truth greater than any king's decree, that freedom was not given, but won through the courage to leave everything behind and face the unknown. The sea still roared in their memories, but now it was behind them. Before them stretched generations who would carry their name, their struggle, and their dream forward into the heart of America. Wilderness and settlement, 1630 to 1670. The forest was endless, a wall of green and shadow that pressed against the clearing where the Whitfields had built their cabin. At dawn, the mist clung low to the ground, and the cry of unseen creatures carried across the trees. Thomas Whitfield rose early each morning, the axe heavy in his hand, and stepped into that forest as though into battle. Each tree he felled was a victory. Each stump a claim wrested from the wilderness. Margaret watched him from the doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the chill, her children clustered around her skirts. The wilderness was both blessing and curse-rich soil beneath, endless timber for shelter, rivers thick with fish yet, also terror. For within it lurked hunger, wild beasts, and the people who had lived here long before the English ships arrived. The 1630s brought more settlers. Ships landed at Massachusetts Bay, carrying hundreds more men, women, and children who sought the same freedom the Whitfields had braved the sea for. Soon towns rose: Salem, Boston, Plymouth, small wooden houses huddled against one another, church spires piercing the sky like fingers pointing to heaven. The Whitfields saw their small community grow into a township, where meetings were held, laws written, and disputes settled beneath the watchful eyes of ministers. Life was stern and narrow. The Sabbath was sacred. No laughter or play could disturb its silence. Margaret scolded her children when they dared to chase one another on Sundays. To defy the Sabbath was to defy God, and in these harsh years, no one dared invite his wrath. Yet, despite strictness, life was fragile. Winters were long and cruel. More than once, the Whitfields nearly starved when crops failed, their meals dwindling to thin porridge and salted roots. Thomas trapped rabbits in the snow, their meager flesh keeping the family alive until the thaw. Margaret taught her children to stretch every crumb, to give thanks even when their bellies ached. By the 1640s, their eldest son, Jonathan, had grown tall and strong. His hands as calloused as his father's, he hunted with bow and musket, patrolled the edges of the settlement, and spoke often of the dangers that lurked beyond. Raids from hostile tribes struck fear into the hearts of settlers. Smoke would rise suddenly in the distance. A farmstead burned, a family slain. Yet not all encounters were hostile. Some tribes traded corn, beans, and furs for iron tools and cloth. Thomas, wary but practical, learned to bargain carefully, knowing survival depended not only on the land, but also on the uneasy peace with those who had walked it long before. The Whitfield daughters, Anne and Elizabeth, grew into young women beneath Margaret's stern guidance. They spun wool, tended the hearth, and learned the scriptures by heart. Yet in the quiet of evening, when chores were done, they whispered to one another of marriage, of children yet unborn, of hopes for gentler days. Suitors, came farmers, carpenters, young men whose futures were as rough-hewn as their hands, and Margaret counseled her daughters to choose wisely. In this harsh land, a husband meant not only love, but survival. As years turned, the settlement grew stricter in its ways. Ministers thundered from pulpits about sin, temptation, and the devil's snares. Every sickness, every storm, every crop failure, was weighed as possible judgment. The Whitfields saw neighbors punished for gossip, for idleness, for speaking against the minister. Stocks and whippings were common, warnings to others to stay within the narrow path. Margaret herself once stood accused of neglecting the Sabbath, because she had baked bread for a sick child. Though spared harsher punishment, she never forgot the humiliation of standing before the congregation, forced to confess what she did not consider sin. The 1650s brought both prosperity and grief. The orchard Thomas had planted bore more fruit each year. Cider became prized, a rare sweetness in the hard life of the colony. Yet death was never far. Sickness swept through one winter, claiming their daughter Elizabeth. Margaret wept until her voice broke. Clutching the small Bible that had crossed the sea with them, reading aloud verses of hope in heaven. Thomas carved a simple wooden cross for her grave, placing it upon the hill overlooking the orchard. He stood there often, hat in hand, the wind tugging at his hair, wondering if all their struggle was worth the price they paid in flesh and blood. By the 1660s, Jonathan had children of his own. He built his cabin not far from his parents, his wife Mary, bearing him sons who carried muskets almost as soon as they could walk. The Whitfields became a clan within the township, their roots sinking deeper into the soil of Massachusetts. Yet with each generation, new fears grew. The forest still pressed against their clearings, a reminder that they were never fully in control. The native tribes, pushed back by settlers, struck more fiercely in retaliation. Rumors of witches spread, whispered at night, spoken aloud in daylight, as though the devil himself walked among them. Margaret, now gray-haired, saw the darkness of suspicion poison the town. A woman who lived alone was accused of bewitching cattle, another of casting spells upon children. Trials were held, confessions wrung through fear. Margaret prayed that her family would never be touched by such madness. Yet she could feel the eyes of neighbors lingering too long, could hear whispers when she walked to the market. Her bread had once condemned her. Would her kindness condemn her again? Through these years, Thomas aged into a patriarch, his hands still strong, though his back bent. He watched grandchildren run among the orchard trees, their laughter rising into the air. And he told them stories of the great sea they had crossed, of the storms and hunger and death that had brought them here. Remember, he told them, freedom costs dearly. Every apple you eat, every breath you take in this land was bought with pain. Never forget it. In 1670, 50 years after stepping onto the rocky shore of New England, the Whitfields had become part of the land itself. Their cabin had grown into a sturdy farmhouse, their fields wide with corn, their orchard heavy with fruit. But beneath their blessings lay shadows' graves on the hill, scars from hunger, memories of terror in the night. They were survivors, yes, but also witnesses to the hard truth that America was no gentle land. It was a land that demanded everything: faith, strength, sacrifice, and gave nothing freely. And in the distant rumble of unrest, in whispers of devils and witches, in the uneasy peace with tribes whose lands were taken, the Whitfields sensed that their struggle was far from over. The wilderness was tamed, but the human heart, with its fear and its fire, remained untamed still. War on the Frontier, 1675 to 1690. The year 1675 dawned with unease. Winter had broken, yet instead of peace, rumors drifted through the settlements like smoke rumors of war. The uneasy truce with the native tribes, a fragile balance built over years of trade and wary tolerance, had shattered. Massasoit, the great leader who once welcomed the first English settlers, was dead. His son Metacomb, whom the colonists called King Philip, had grown weary of broken promises, land stolen, and his people pressed ever backward by the relentless tide of settlers. Now the forest whispered with the sound of war drums, and blood began to stain the frontier. The Whitfields had felt the tension rising for months. Jonathan, now a seasoned man of 40, watched from the edge of his fields as shadows moved in the trees, not deer or fox, but warriors. His father Thomas, though old and bent, sensed the coming storm as well. "The land remembers what we took," he muttered one evening by the hearth, staring into the flames as his grandchildren listened, wide-eyed. Margaret hushed him, but in her heart she knew it true. Then the violence erupted. In June of that year, a small settlement nearby was attacked at dawn, cabins burned, men slain, women and children carried off. The news reached the Whitfields, As the smoke still rose on the horizon, panic spread like fire. Families abandoned outlying farms, retreating toward larger towns for protection. But Jonathan refused to leave. "This is our land," he declared, musket in hand. "We've cut these fields with our blood and sweat. I will not yield them." His brothers and neighbors agreed, though their wives wept at the thought of arrows in the night. The months that followed were a nightmare. Skirmishes flared across New England. Bands of native warriors struck without warning, vanishing back into the forests before militias could respond. Entire villages were wiped away in a single night. Smoke hung over the countryside, black columns marking each ruin. The Whitfields took turns keeping watch, posting suns at the orchard's edge, while women and children slept fitfully within the fortified cabin. Even young Samuel, only 13, clutched a musket, his eyes hard with a fear that had no place in childhood. In August, the war came directly to them. Jonathan's farm was ambushed at dusk. Arrows hissed through the air, one striking the cabin door with a thud. Shouts erupted, and flames licked at the barn as warriors set it alight. The Whitfields fought desperately. Jonathan fired into the dark, reloading as quickly as shaking hands allowed. His eldest son Matthew stood beside him, smoke stinging his eyes. Margaret, gray-haired yet unyielding, thrust a bucket into younger hands, urging them to douse sparks before the fire consumed the house. The attack lasted less than an hour, but it left devastation behind. The barn was gone, cattle slain, and blood stained the ground where 2 neighbors lay dead. The family survived, yet their sense of safety was shattered forever. Winter brought no respite. Food grew scarce as fields lay abandoned and trade collapsed. Starvation gnawed at both settlers and natives alike, each side driven by desperation. Jonathan's family boiled leather for broth, scraped bark for sustenance. Margaret divided the last of their grain into smaller and smaller portions, praying it would last. Disease crept through the weekend, claiming the youngest and oldest first. Elizabeth's child, barely 2 years old, died in Margaret's arms one snowbound night, her small breath fading as the wind howled outside. The grief was so deep it left no tears, only silence. Yet amidst the horror, bonds hardened. The Whitfields stood with their neighbors, men forming militias to patrol the woods, women caring for the wounded, children carrying water and messages as if already grown. Fear became routine. The sound of distant gunfire barely stirred alarm anymore. Each sunrise was a victory, each meal a blessing wrung from the earth and defended with blood. By 1676, the war reached its terrible peak. Colonist militias struck back with ferocity, burning native villages, slaughtering women and children in retaliation. It was a cycle of vengeance, with no mercy on either side. Jonathan joined raids that left him haunted, his musket barrel hot from firing into the night, his ears ringing with screams. Returned home gaunt and silent, his wife Mary pressing his hand though she dared not ask what he had seen. Thomas, too frail to fight, prayed for his son's soul, knowing the war-carved scars that no hymn could heal. Then came the end. King Philip himself was hunted down and killed in August of 1676. His body mutilated, his head displayed on a pike in Plymouth as a grim warning. The colonists rejoiced, calling it God's justice. But for the Whitfields, there was no triumph, only exhaustion. The land around them lay in ashes, fields barren, families shattered. Thousands were dead, both settler and native, and the fragile world the Whitfields had built was forever changed. In the years that followed, the war's shadow lingered. The Whitfields rebuilt slowly, planting again in scarred soil, raising new barns from the blackened timbers. Children grew, marriages were made, and life staggered forward. Yet the memory of fire in the night, of arrows striking wood, of hunger gnawing bone, never left them. Samuel, who had fought as a boy, became a stern man, distrustful of strangers, his eyes always on the tree line. Jonathan aged before his time, his hair graying, his voice weary. Margaret, ever steadfast, told the younger ones that their survival was proof of God's will, that endurance was their destiny. By 1690, the Whitfields were once more a strong family in Massachusetts. Their farm flourishing again, their orchard bearing fruit, but beneath the peace lay scars invisible yet unhealed. They had endured one of the bloodiest wars ever to strike New England, a war that left nearly every family touched by grief. For the Whitfields, the lesson was carved deep. The land they had claimed was no gift, but a prize taken by force, held by vigilance, and defended at the cost of lives. On quiet evenings, Thomas, now near death, would sit by the orchard with his grandchildren gathered close. His voice cracked with age. He told them of the voyage across the sea, of the wilderness tamed, of the war survived. "This land is ours now," he said, though his eyes clouded with doubt. "But remember, children, it was never given freely. Everything here is bought with sacrifice." The children listened, the apple trees swaying gently above them, the sun sinking red over the forest. They could not know that their lives would face storms yet to come, which trials. Revolutions, civil wars, but in that moment, they carried forward the memory of survival, the Whitfield legacy written in blood and soil. And so the frontier grew quieter, but never truly at peace. The land had tasted war, and the people who lived upon it had learned that in America survival was never without cost. Seeds of rebellion, 1700 to 1750. The dawn of the 18th century brought a different air to New England. The smell of smoke and blood from King Philip's War still lingered in memory, but the land itself seemed determined to heal. Farms spread wider, orchards grew thicker, and trade routes linked one settlement to another like threads in a vast tapestry. For the Whitfields, the turn of the century marked both recovery and transformation. Jonathan Whitfield's sons Samuel and Matthew had become men of stature in their township. Their father's musket hung above the hearth as a relic of survival, but their own lives were less about war and more about growth. Samuel plowed wide fields of corn, his oxen strong and steady. Matthew turned his hand toward trade, buying and selling goods carried by wagon and ship. His name known in Boston's markets, their prosperity, hard-won across generations, was a quiet defiance against the wilderness that had once threatened to consume them. By 1710, Boston was no longer a cluster of fragile wooden huts, but a bustling port city. Its wharves alive with sailors, merchants, and ships heavy with cargo. Rum, molasses, tobacco, and fish flowed in and out, wealth pooling in the hands of those clever enough to seize opportunity. Matthew Whitfield was among them. Though no great magnate, he built a modest fleet of trading vessels that carried apples, the cider and timber down the coast, and returned with sugar and goods from the West Indies. His children grew up with the salt of the sea in their lungs and the hum of commerce in their ears. But prosperity carried its own burdens. England watched its colonies with a jealous eye, tightening its grip with taxes and trade restrictions. Laws demanded that colonial goods be carried only on English ships, that profits flow through English hands. Samuel grumbled as he sold his harvest for less than its worth, watching merchants in London grow rich on his labor. "We till the earth," he spat one night, "and yet it is they who reap." His neighbors muttered the same, though few dared say it too loudly. Margaret's grandchildren grew beneath the stern rhythms of Puritan life. The Sabbath remained sacred, schools taught obedience as much as letters, and the ministers thundered warnings of sin from their pulpits. Yet the younger Whitfields were different from their forebears. They had not crossed the sea, nor fought in the wilderness, nor hidden from raids in the night. They were born in America, raised in its soil, and though they spoke of themselves as English subjects, their loyalty to a distant king was more abstract than real. As the 1720s rolled on, cracks appeared in the old ways. The Great Awakening swept across New England. Preachers traveling from town to town, calling men and women to repent with fiery words. Camp meetings drew hundreds who wept, shouted, and fell to their knees, seized by visions of heaven and hell. Samuel's daughter Abigail returned from one such gathering with eyes shining, her voice trembling with conviction. "God has spoken to me," she told her family. "He has called us to a new life, a purer life." Margaret's Bible was still read each evening, but now new voices clamored to be heard, challenging the rigid order of ministers who had ruled since the colony's birth. Change came, too, in the form of conflict. The French and their Indian allies harried the northern frontiers, dragging Massachusetts men into wars not of their choosing. Samuel's eldest son, Jacob, marched north with the militia in 1745, musket on shoulder, to fight in the capture of Louisbourg. He wrote home of the roar of cannon, of the bitter cold on campaign, of comrades dying beside him not for their own land but for the ambitions of distant kings. His letters carried pride, but also wariness. What is it to us if Britain claims Canada? Will the French sow our fields or feed our children? No, it is our backs that bear the burden, our blood that stains the snow. Back in Boston, Matthew's sons tasted the sharp edges of trade restrictions. Customs officials prowled the docks, seizing goods deemed unlawful, demanding bribes, and enforcing the navigation acts. Anger simmered in taverns, merchants muttering that they were treated not as free men, but as tools for the crown. One evening, over a jug of cider pressed from the Whitfield orchard, Matthew's son Thomas whispered to a circle of friends, "We are not children of England anymore. We are something else. We are Americans." By mid-century, the Whitfields embodied the contradictions of colonial life. They were prosperous yet constrained, devout yet restless, loyal yet increasingly resentful. The orchard, now vast and fruitful, remained the family's heart, its apples carried by ship to markets far away. At harvest feasts, grandchildren and cousins gathered beneath its boughs, laughter mingling with the smell of roasting meat. But even in those moments of joy, talk turned to England's grips, taxes, its wars, its distant rule over a people who had grown strong in a new world. In 1750, an aging Samuel stood before his children and grandchildren in the orchard. His hair was white, his back stooped, but his voice carried still. "This land has shaped us," he told them, gesturing to the trees heavy with fruit. "We are not the same as those who came before. We're not Englishmen anymore, though we speak their tongue. We're something new. The day will come when England will try to remind us we are theirs. And when it comes, remember this freedom is not given, is taken." His words were not recorded in any book, not thundered from any pulpit, not carried across the sea. They lived only in the ears of his kin and the hearts of those who bore the Whitfield name, yet they were prophetic. For in the years to come, the seeds of rebellion planted in the soil of resentment would sprout, watered by blood and fire. The Whitfields, like so many families across New England, stood at the edge of a new age, unaware of how soon their world would be swept into the storm of revolution. The spark of revolution 1765 to 1775, the middle of the 18th century, should have been an age of ease for the Whitfields. Their orchards stretched wider than ever. Their ships carried cider and timber along the coast, and their sons and daughters married into other sturdy New England families. Yet prosperity never comes without shadow, and by the 1760s, a new shadow crept across the colonies, not hunger, nor wilderness, nor war with native tribes, but the heavy hand of Britain itself. The first rumblings came with taxes. 1765, news spread of the Stamp Act, a decree from London demanding that every legal document, newspaper, pamphlet, and even deck of cards bear an official stamp purchased with hard coin. At first it seemed absurd, a meddling law from across the sea. But when collectors arrived in Boston demanding payment, laughter turned to rage. In taverns, men shouted that they were treated like vassals, taxed without a voice in Parliament. No taxation without representation. The cry rose, sharp as musket fire. Among those voices was Thomas Whitfield, grandson of Jonathan, a merchant whose ships sailed from Boston Harbor. He had seen too many of his profits eaten by duties and tariffs, too many officials pawing through his goods. Now the Stamp Act threatened to cut even deeper. He gathered with other merchants in a crowded tavern, their mugs slamming the tables as they swore to resist. "We are not subjects to be milked dry," Thomas thundered. "We are men of this land, and we will not bend." Resistance grew bold. Effigies of tax collectors were hanged in the streets. Riots broke out, windows smashed, offices burned. The Whitfields, though not all hot-headed, found themselves drawn into the fervor. Thomas's eldest son, Nathaniel, only 18, joined the Sons of Liberty, a secret society sworn to defy Britain's tyranny. He returned home late at night with fire in his eyes, whispering of plots and protests, of meetings held in back rooms where men spoke openly of independence. His mother worried, but Thomas clapped his son on the shoulder. "Better to stand for freedom, lad, than to live as a servant." Boston became a cauldron. Red-coated soldiers marched its streets, muskets gleaming in the sun, their presence a daily reminder of Britain's will. Skirmishes flared between townsfolk and soldiers' shouts, stones, fists thrown. Then, in 1770, blood spilled. Nathaniel was among the crowd on King Street when soldiers fired into a gearing mob. He saw men fall, their blood staining the snow, the screams echoing off brick walls. The Boston Massacre, they called it afterward. Nathaniel carried the memory home, his voice hoarse as he recounted it to his family. "They fire on us as if we are enemies," he said. "But we are their own blood." His younger brothers, wide-eyed, listened with awe and anger. The Whitfields knew then that peace was slipping away. The years that followed tightened the coil. More taxes came, more restrictions, more soldiers filling taverns and commandeering homes. Then in 1773, tea became the symbol of defiance. Parliament demanded its duty. Colonists swore they would not pay. One December night, Nathaniel donned a disguise, feathers in his hair, his face smeared with soot. Alongside dozens of others, he boarded the ships in Boston Harbor and heaved crates of tea into the icy water. The Boston Tea Party, it would be called, though to Nathaniel it was no party but a declaration. He returned home soaked and shivering, eyes alight with triumph. "We have shown them," he told his father. "We will not be chained." Repercussions came swift. Britain struck back with the coercive axe, closing Boston's harbor, stripping away self-government, tightening its iron fist. Trade collapsed, families suffered, soldiers quartered in private homes. The Whitfields, whose orchard cider once flowed freely to market, now saw barrels rot in their cellars. Hunger returned, not from wilderness this time, but from blockade. Yet hardship only deepened resolve. From New Hampshire to Virginia, colonies rallied to Boston's side, sending food, supplies, and words of unity. A spark lit in Massachusetts was spreading into fire across the continent. By 1774, the Whitfields could no longer stand apart. The family gathered one autumn evening in the farmhouse, the orchard leaves blazing red outside. Thomas, his hair silvered with age, sat at the head of the table. His sons and daughters, his grandchildren, filled the room with restless energy. "We stand at the edge of something greater than any of us," he told them, his voice steady. "England believes us weak, divided, children to be scolded. But I say we are a people now, a new people. We have tilled this land, bled for it, buried our dead in its soil. It is ours, not theirs. And if it comes to war, so be it." The words hung heavy in the air. Margaret's great-granddaughter wept softly, clutching her infant. Nathaniel's young brother Samuel swore he would carry a musket when the time came. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, as though the night itself bore witness. The time came sooner than they imagined. In April 1775, the alarm spread. British troops were marching on Concord to seize colonial arms. Lanterns were lit, riders sent galloping through the night. "The regulars are coming," echoed from village to village. Nathaniel shouldered his musket, kissed his mother's cheek, and joined the militia gathering on Lexington Green. His father gripped his hand, pride and fear warring in his eyes. "Stand firm, son," he whispered. "Stand firm for all of us." At dawn, when the redcoats faced the farmers and merchants of Massachusetts, muskets leveled, a shot rang out, no one knew from which side. Smoke, shouts, chaos erupted. The revolution had begun. Nathaniel Whitfield, son of Boston, grandson of pioneers, stood in that line, his heart pounding. His destiny bound not only to his family, but to the birth of a nation. And in the farmhouse orchard, as news spread that blood had been spilled, the Whitfields knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The seeds of rebellion had grown into fire, and the storm of war was upon them. Liberty or death, 1775 to 1783. The morning bells of Lexington had hardly ceased ringing before the world changed for the Whitfields. Word swept through Boston and the outlying villages like wildfire, shots fired. Men dead, the militia scattered. And yet the British retreat harried all the way back to the city by farmers and blacksmiths wielding muskets. The echo of those first volleys would not fade. They rippled across the colonies, stirring every household to reckon with the choice before thems. For Nathaniel Whitfield, who had stood on Lexington Green, there was no hesitation. He had seen the glint of British bayonets, heard the thud of musket balls into earth, felt the surge of terror and resolve that came when neighbors dropped around him. He returned home not with despair, but with a fiery determination. His shirt was torn, his knuckles scraped, but his voice rang like steel. "We are not subjects any longer. We are Americans now, and I will fight until we are free." The Whitfield farmhouse became a gathering place for militia. Muskets leaned against the walls, powder horns filled, bread baked and shared as men plotted routes and sent scouts. Thomas Whitfield, though too old to march, oversaw the efforts with a patriarch's pride. His wife prepared poultices and bandages, knowing wounded men would soon come. Even the younger children carried water, sewed shirts, and ran errands, for all felt themselves soldiers in this struggle. Boston itself became a fortress. The British held the city with warships in the harbor, redcoats filling its streets, while colonial militias encircled it on the hills. The Whitfields, divided between their farm and Nathaniel's merchant contacts in Boston, lived half in secrecy, smuggling powder and food, past patrols. When the Battle of Bunker Hill erupted in June 1775, Nathaniel was there. He saw the hill blaze with musket fire, saw men fall in rows, heard the shouted command, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The colonists lost the hill, yet they proved to the world and to themselves that they could stand toe-to-toe with Britain's finest. Nathaniel carried the memory as both wound and inspiration, his resolve unshaken. That same summer, across the colonies, murmurs of independence grew louder. Delegates gathered in Philadelphia, words of liberty and defiance whispered in taverns and printed in broadsheets. The Whitfields followed every scrap of news with hungry eyes. When in July 1776 a messenger rode into their town carrying a copy of the Declaration of Independence, the family assembled in the orchard, neighbors gathering too. As Thomas read aloud Jefferson's words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Voices cheered, hats flew into the air, tears streamed down cheeks. For that moment, the dream of freedom felt close enough to touch. But dreams are costly. The war stretched on, harsher than any had imagined. British armies marched through New York, Philadelphia, and the southern colonies, leaving fire and ruin in their wake. Nathaniel enlisted in the Continental Army under General Washington, trading the safety of home for the uncertainty of campaign. His letters, carried by weary couriers, became the family's lifeline, tales of ragged men with bare feet marching across frozen ground, of hunger gnawing at bellies, of hope flickering in the shadow of despair. At Valley Forge he nearly froze, yet in his letter he wrote, "Tell Father that our cause burns hotter than any hearth fire. We will endure." The Whitfield farm, meanwhile, endured its own battles. With men gone to war, women and children bore the burden of plowing, harvesting, defending against raids. British patrols scoured the countryside for supplies, and more than once, Margaret's descendants hid barrels of cider and sacks of grain beneath floorboards, risking flogging if discovered. Tories colonists loyal to the crown sometimes betrayed neighbors, and suspicion cut deep wounds through once friendly villages. The war was not only muskets and cannons, it was a tearing of communities, of families, of souls. Yet victories came too. Nathaniel fought at Saratoga in 1777. Where colonial troops forced a British surrender so stunning it drew France into the war on America's side. His letter home was stained with mud and sweat, but filled with triumph. "We have shown the world we are not rebels, but a nation." France sends ships, and with them, hope. His brothers, still too young for the army, drilled with the local militia, dreaming of their turn. Through those long years, liberty remained both a star in the sky and a weight on the heart. The Whitfields lost friends to battle, neighbors to disease, and fields to neglect. Yet they also gained stories of courage, sacrifice, endurance that would be retold for generations. The final crucible came in 1781, when Washington and his allies cornered General Cornwallis at Yorktown. Nathaniel, now a hardened soldier, was among the ranks that marched through mud and gunfire. French cannons booming beside them, until at last the British raised the white flag. He wrote only one line in his final wartime letter: "It is done." When he returned to the farmhouse months later, gaunt and scarred but alive, the family embraced him as if risen from the grave. His father wept openly, his mother clung to him, his siblings crowded close, drinking in every word of his tale. The orchard bloomed again that spring, as though the land itself celebrated the birth of a new nation. But liberty came not without loss. Several cousins never returned, their graves scattered across battlefields. Fields once rich with grain lay barren from years of neglect. The Whitfields had paid a price, as had every family. Yet when the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, formally recognizing the United States of America, Thomas Whitfield gathered his family once more in the orchard and spoke. "We are free. Our children will not bow to kings. We are a people who stood, bled, and endured. Remember this, and teach it to those who come after, for freedom must be guarded as fiercely as it was won." Thus ended the War of Independence for the Whitfields, from pioneers who carved orchards out of wilderness to patriots who stood against empire. Their story had become bound with the story of the nation itself. They had chosen liberty, though it cost them dearly, and in that choice, it secured not only their future, but the future of a land that would rise from struggle to greatness. A new nation, 1783 to 1800. The smoke of war had barely cleared when the Whitfields, like millions of others, found themselves standing at the edge of something both thrilling and terrifying. A nation newly born, but fragile as a foal still finding its legs. Independence was won on paper with the Treaty of Paris, but what, Nathaniel wondered as he stared at his calloused hands, had truly been secured? Freedom was not food on the table, was not a roof kept mended, or debts paid, or fields planted. Freedom was promise. And promise, as the Whitfields would learn, demanded both faith and work to keep alive. In the first years after the Revolution, the family farm struggled to regain its rhythm. For 8 long seasons, fields had been neglected, stone fences had crumbled, orchards gone unpruned. Nathaniel returned from the army leaner and older in spirit, took the lead in rebuilding. His father Thomas's hair was now white, his back bent, but he still walked the furrows each morning, instructing the boys where to turn the plow and when to cut hay. His mother, ever steady, kept the household stitched together, weaving not just cloth but morale. Neighbors, too, were mending what the war had torn. Some loyalists, who had sided with Britain, fled north to Canada. Others remained, shunned or eyed with suspicion. Communities reknit themselves unevenly. Old friendships strained, but necessity bound them. If fences weren't mended, livestock wandered. Barns weren't raised, grain rotted in fields. Slowly, through shared work and shared hunger, people remembered how to lean on one another. Nathaniel had hoped the Continental Army's sacrifices would be met with gratitude in coin. But instead he found himself holding little more than promissory notes. The new Congress had no money, no power to tax, and soldiers were often paid in paper that merchants laughed at. For years the Whitfields bartered more than they bought. Bushels of apples went to the blacksmith for nails, to the cobbler for shoes, to the tavern for salt. Liberty was a fine word, but liberty did not pay debts. And yet there was pride. Pride when riders came with news that George Washington, the general who had refused a crown, had gone home to Mount Vernon instead of seizing power. Pride when delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to hammer out a constitution to bind 13 fractious states into one. The Whitfields followed the debates through broadsheets smuggled into their small town, arguing by the hearth whether a strong central government would protect or oppress them. Nathaniel, scarred by war, leaned toward unity. "Without a government with teeth, Britain or Spain will eat us alive." His younger brother, Samuel, full of frontier spirit, bristled. "We didn't trade one king for another in Philadelphia." When word came in 1789 that the Constitution had been ratified and Washington sworn in as the first president, the Whitfields felt a collective exhale. A beginning. Fragile, yes, but real. That summer, Thomas gathered the family under the blooming orchard, as he had so many times before. His voice cracked with age, but not with doubt. "We planted this farm when the land was raw. We fought for freedom when it was but an idea. Now we must tend this nation as we tend our fields. It will grow if we are diligent." The orchard became their emblem of endurance. Each spring the blossoms promised renewal. Each autumn the harvest promised reward. But the broader land beyond their fences was shifting fast. Settlers surged westward into Ohio and Kentucky, hungry for land. Native nations resisted, unwilling to cede their homes. Word of skirmishes filtered back, small wars waged on the frontier. Samuel, restless for adventure, talked of leaving to claim land beyond the Appalachians. Nathaniel cautioned him. "The soil there is watered with blood. Be sure of what you seek." Meanwhile, politics seeped into even rural towns. Federalists and Democratic Republicans argued fiercely, pamphlets painting opponents as tyrants or traitors. In taverns, neighbors shouted about Hamilton's financial plans, Jefferson's visions of agrarian liberty, and the great question of whether this republic would favor farmers or merchants, states or nation. The Whitfields, being both farmers and merchants in part, felt tugged in both directions. Nathaniel respected Hamilton's drive for stability but feared debt's chains. Samuel admired Jefferson's call for yeoman independence, but wondered if it was naive in a world of armies and empires. The wider world, too, intruded. In 1793, news of revolution in France split opinion. Some hailed it as the flowering of the same liberty America had fought for. Others recoiled at tales of guillotines. In the Whitfield farmhouse, arguments grew heated. "They fight for the same rights we declared," Samuel insisted. But Nathaniel shook his head. "Rights drowned in blood are not rights at all." Even the orchard heard whispers of politics. One autumn day, as apples were gathered into barrels for shipment, a neighbor rode up waving a handbill denouncing the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. Farmers there, taxed on their grain liquor, had risen up in arms. Washington himself marched troops to quell them. The Whitfields stood silently as they read the words. At last Thomas murmured, "If a farmer must take up arms against his own government so soon after we bled to build it, then we are still learning what freedom means." As the decade closed, Thomas's health declined. The patriarch who had planted the first trees and told the first stories sat more often in his chair, his gaze lost in memory. One evening, as the family gathered, he called for silence. His voice was faint but steady. "I will not live to see what this nation becomes. But I have seen it born, seen it survive its cradle years. You, my children, must carry it forward. Guard it against enemies without and against pride within. Remember, freedom is not a harvest to reap, once it is a field to tend each season." When Thomas passed in 1798, the orchard bells tolled heavy. Neighbors gathered to bury him beneath the oldest apple tree, his grave marked by a simple stone. Nathaniel placed his father's musket upon the fresh earth, a symbol of both struggle and defense. The family stood hand in hand, the sun setting crimson behind them, and vowed to honor his charge. By 1800, as a new century dawned, the Whitfields found themselves woven deeply into the fabric of a nation that was no longer an experiment, but a reality imperfect, divided yet alive. Washington had stepped down after 2 terms, refusing to be king. John Adams sat as president, his Federalist policies stirring controversy. In every farmhouse, every tavern, every marketplace, the conversation was the same. What will America be? The Whitfields, in their orchard, knew the answer was not yet written. But they believed stubbornly, passionately, that their sweat, their toil, their choices would help shape it. And so they carried on, plowing and planting, debating and dreaming, tending both their fields and their fragile, growing republic. The fires of expansion, 1800 to 1820. The new century arrived with frost on the orchard and uncertainty in the air. America had survived its infancy, but like a restless youth it was eager to stretch, to test the boundaries of its strength. For the Whitfields, the year 1800 was not only a marker of Timit, was a turning of the page. Thomas Whitfield, the patriarch, was gone. His grave beneath the old apple tree had become a place of quiet visits where family members paused after chores to reflect. Nathaniel, now the head of the family, felt the weight of his father's charge, to guard both farm and republic. Yet while Nathaniel was rooted, his younger brother Samuel burned with wanderlust. Tales of western lands, Ohio's fertile valleys, Kentucky's rolling hills, the Mississippi's endless waters drifted eastward on every breeze. Men returned with stories of forests to be cleared, rivers to be tamed, fortunes to be seized. "The nation grows westward," Samuel declared one evening by the fire, "and I'll not be left behind." Nathaniel frowned, staring into the flames. "The frontier is no orchard, brother. It is axe and musket, hardship and danger." But Samuel's eyes gleamed. Danger, yes, but also destiny. The Whitfields were not immune to the pull of expansion. In 1803, Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase doubled the nation overnight. Maps pinned to tavern walls showed a continent suddenly wide with possibility, stretching from the Mississippi to distant mountains few had seen. The news thrilled Samuel, who now pressed harder to leave. Nathaniel, though wary, recognized the tide of history. "If you go," he told his brother, "take with you father's lessons, build with care. Fight only when you must, and never forget where your roots lie." That spring, Samuel kissed his mother's cheek, clasped Nathaniel's hand, and set off west with a wagon train bound for Ohio. His departure left a silence in the farmhouse, an emptiness at supper, but also a sense of pride. He was a Whitfield, carrying the family name into the wilderness. Letters came sporadically, carried by traders and riders. Tales of forests felled, cabins raised, and skirmishes with both nature and men. Samuel wrote of wolves circling camps, of rivers swollen with spring floods, of nights where the stars burned so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. He also wrote of neighbors who quarreled over land lines, and of native peoples who fought to keep what was theirs. "This land is no gift," he wrote once, "but a contest. Every acre is won by sweat or blood." Meanwhile, back in Massachusetts, the orchard thrived. Nathaniel's children, Thomas's grandchildren, were growing. Learning to graft trees, to mend fences, to argue politics by candlelight. The election of 1800, in which Jefferson unseated Adams, was a topic of fierce debate. Some neighbors feared the republic would collapse into chaos. Others hailed it as proof that power could change hands peacefully. Nathaniel, though cautious, felt a surge of faith. If men could argue without arms, then perhaps his father's dream of lasting freedom was not in vain. The wider world, however, intruded harshly. Across the Atlantic, Britain and France waged endless war, each seeking to strangle the other. America, caught in the middle, found its ships seized, its sailors impressed into foreign navies. Nathaniel's eldest son, young Thomas, longed for adventure at sea and signed on with a merchant vessel. But letters soon told of danger on the high seas, of British frigates looming like wolves. In 1807, when Jefferson answered with his ill-fated embargo, the Whitfields felt the sting. Trade slowed to a crawl. Apples rotted unsold. Barrels of cider gathered dust. Nathaniel gritted his teeth. "We are pawns in a game played by kings across the ocean," he muttered. By 1812, matters came to a head. War was declared on Britain, and the drums of conflict echoed again. For Nathaniel, memories of the Revolution were still raw, but now it was his son who marched. Young Thomas donned militia gray and joined the fight near the Canadian border. Letters spoke of skirmishes in forests, thick with smoke, of nights huddled in mud, of the roar of cannons at places like Lundy's Lane. Nathaniel's heart ached with pride and fear. He prayed by the old apple tree each night, whispering the same words his father once had: "Bring him home." The war raged uncertainly, victories and defeats traded like blows. In 1814, news arrived that Washington itself had been burned, the president's mansion left smoldering. The Whitfields listened in stunned silence as the tale was read aloud in the tavern. "Are we so weak still," Nathaniel wondered aloud, "that our very capital can be put to the torch?" Yet hope rekindled when news came of Baltimore's defense and the flag that waved defiantly at dawn. When peace was finally signed in 1815, relief washed over the farm. Young Thomas returned, scarred but alive, his eyes older than his years. He spoke little of the war, save for one memory. Standing on a ridge at sunrise, the sound of muskets fading. Realizing that America had survived again, bruised but unbroken. The years after the war brought change as swift as spring floods. Roads improved, canals were dug, commerce bustled. The Whitfields shipped cider downriver to distant markets, marveling at the reach of their once local orchard. Nathaniel Gray, now at the Temples, watched with cautious optimism. "The nation grows not just in land, but in ambition," he said. "Let us hope it does not grow too fast for its roots." Letters from Samuel told of similar change on the frontier. Ohio, once wild, was filling with towns, schools, churches. But he also wrote of sorrow, neighbors struck down by fevers, friendships broken by disputes, native tribes pushed ever farther west. "The land we conquer does not forget," he warned. "Its ghosts walk beside us." By 1820, as the family gathered beneath the old apple tree for another planting season, Nathaniel reflected on 2 decades of trial and triumph. His father's words still rang in his ears. Freedom is a field to tend each season. And indeed, the Republic had been tested by politics, by foreign war, by the hunger of expansion, and had survived. Yet he sensed deeper conflicts brewing, questions unresolved. About land, about slavery, about who truly belonged to this nation. As the sun dipped behind the orchard, Nathaniel placed a hand on the trunk of the oldest apple tree, its bark rough, its branches still reaching skyward. "We endure," he whispered, "as does our nation. But both must be pruned with care, lest they grow wild." And so the Whitfields, like America itself, stepped into the 1820s. Older, scarred, yet hopeful, caught between the pull of tradition and the fire of expansion, uncertain of what storms the next decades would bring. The rising storm, 1820 to 1840. The decade of the 1820s dawned not with quiet certainty, but with a sense of unease, as if storm clouds gathered on a horizon not yet visible. For the Whitfields, the orchard still bore fruit. Children still played between rows of trees, and the farmhouse hearth still glowed with warmth. But beneath the surface of American life, deep fissures began to spread. And in every conversation, every law, every journey westward, one question whispered louder. What kind of nation were they truly building? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was the first thunderclap of this storm. In Massachusetts, where the Whitfields lived, debates spilled from newspapers into taverns and church pews. Could new states enter the Union as slaveholding, or would they be free? Missouri's petition to allow slavery threatened to tip the fragile balance. Nathaniel, by now a gray-haired patriarch leaning heavily on his cane, sat by the hearth as his children argued. Young Thomas, hardened by war, shook his head in anger. "How can we call ourselves free if we chain men like cattle?" His cousin Caleb, visiting from a merchant family in Boston, spoke more cautiously. "The South will not yield. If pushed, they may tear the Union apart." Nathaniel listened, silent, the flicker of firelight in his eyes. At last he spoke. "Mark my words, the question of slavery is no mere quarrel of laws. It is a wound. If not healed, it will fester until the body itself sickens." Though the compromise temporarily quieted debate admitting Missouri as slave and Maine as free, everyone sensed it was but a bandage on a deeper wound. Meanwhile, life in the orchard continued, though even there the winds of change blew. Nathaniel's younger children and Samuel's offspring from Ohio met one summer, their wagons creaking into the Massachusetts yard after weeks of travel. It was a joyous reunion, cousins laughing beneath the apple trees, trading tales of wilderness and war. Yet even in their merriment, differences showed. The frontier Whitfields spoke of clearing forests, of disputes with native peoples, of the harsh independence required to survive. The eastern Whitfields, more tied to trade and politics, spoke of schools, newspapers, and bustling markets. The family was still one, but their worlds were drifting apart, mirroring the nation itself. The 1820s also brought the rise of a new kind of leader, Andrew Jackson. His name carried across the Republic like a drumbeat, celebrated as the hero of New Orleans, yet feared as a man of fierce temper. To some, he was the champion of the common man, the living embodiment of democratic energy. To others, he was a dangerous demagogue, willing to trample institutions in his pursuit of power. In the taverns of Massachusetts, debates about Jackson grew as fiery as those about slavery. Nathaniel's sons, Thomas and Joseph, often found themselves on opposite sides. "The people have spoken," Joseph cried once, slamming his fist on the table. "Stands with the farmer, the worker, the soldierman, like us." Thomas countered with scorn. "A man who defies courts and bullies opponents is no champion of freedom. Beware the tyrant who calls himself the people's friend." When Jackson swept into office in 1828, it was clear that American politics had changed. Old elites trembled, new voices rose, and with them came turbulence. The Whitfields felt it too, for national storms always reached their farm eventually. The panic of 1819 had already taught them that markets could rise and fall like tides, leaving families scrambling. Now, under Jackson, came fierce fights over banks, tariffs, and Indian lands. It was the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that struck the hardest chord in the Whitfield household. Letters from Samuel's branch in Ohio told of neighbors pushing further west, eager to claim Cherokee and Creek lands newly opened. But Samuel's eldest daughter, Mary, wrote with sorrow. "Father," she penned, "I watched families driven from their homes, their children weeping as soldiers marched them away. Some cheered, saying it was progress. But I cannot cheer. Is this the liberty you and Uncle Nathaniel spoke of?" Nathaniel, upon reading the letter aloud, grew quiet, then said softly, "A nation that forgets mercy will one day beg for it." As the 1830s advanced, new technologies altered life in ways Nathaniel could scarcely have imagined in his youth. Canals carved paths across states, railroads appeared like iron veins across the land, and the telegraph began whispering messages faster than any horse could ride. The Whitfields marveled at these wonders. Joseph invested in a small share of a canal project, dreaming of greater markets for their cider. Young cousins from Ohio wrote of steamboats puffing up the Mississippi, of new towns springing like mushrooms after rain. Yet progress came with costs. Land disputes multiplied, forests fell, and the old rhythms of rural life began to strain under the push of markets and machines. Amid all this, the family faced private trials as well. Nathaniel's health waned, his once strong hands trembling as he pruned the apple trees. He walked the orchard slowly now, leaning on young grandchildren for support. One evening, he called the family together beneath the oldest apple tree, its branches heavy with fruit. "Children," he said, his voice quavering, "this orchard has been our anchor. My father planted it in freedom, I tended it in war and peace, and now it falls to you. Whatever storms may come, remember, liberty must be tended like these trees, pruned, nurtured, defended. Neglect it, and it will rot. Guard it, and it will endure." Tears glistened in his children's eyes as the old man spoke. Nathaniel passed quietly in the winter of 1832, the snow deep around the farmhouse. His funeral drew family from Ohio and Massachusetts alike, their grief mingled with pride. As they lowered him into the earth beside his father, they felt the weight of history pressing down. 3 generations of Whitfields had now lived and died under the flag of the United States. But what of the generations to come? The decade closed with more turbulence still. The nullification crisis in South Carolina tested the Union's strength as a state threatened to break away over tariffs. The Whitfields followed the news anxiously, sensing that the old fear of disunion had returned. Thomas, ever the soldier, declared, "If states can pick and choose which laws to obey, then we are no nation at all." His cousin Caleb shook his head. Better to compromise than to draw blood again. In 1837, as if politics were not enough, the panic struck again, banks collapsing, businesses failing, families ruined. The Whitfields weathered the storm better than most, for the orchard provided food if not wealth. Yet they saw neighbors lose farms, wagons heading west in desperate hope. "The land grows restless," Mary wrote from Ohio. "Our people chase prosperity, but find ruin. Still they press onward, as if the horizon itself promises salvation." By 1840, as the family gathered once more beneath the apple tree, a new generation was rising. The children of Thomas and Joseph, of Samuel and Mary, were nearly grown. They spoke of abolition and expansion, of politics and invention, of dreams that stretched beyond Massachusetts or Ohio. They were Americans of a new century, restless, ambitious, unafraid to speak their minds. Yet as Nathaniel's words lingered in memory, they sensed the truth. Storms were building still, darker and more violent than any they had yet seen. For the Republic, like the orchard, had roots that ran deep, but also fractures that threatened to split the soil itself. And so the Whitfields stepped into the 1840s, heirs of freedom, yet bearers of its burdens. Their lives bound inseparably to the rising storm that would one day break with thunder. Across the wide frontier, 1840 to 1850, the 1840s arrived like a restless wind, carrying both promise and peril across the United States. For the Whitfields, life in Massachusetts and Ohio had provided stability at the wide, untamed lands to the west called irresistibly. Young men and women, grandchildren of Nathaniel and Samuel, felt the pull of opportunity, the fertile prairies of Illinois. the rolling hills of Missouri, and even the distant valleys of California where rumors of gold danced like fireflies. The family, once rooted in a single orchard, now found itself stretched across a continent in imagination, letters, and eventual action. Samuel's eldest son, James, was first to act. By 1841, he had sold a portion of the Ohio land, inherited from his father, and outfitted a wagon train bound for Missouri. His letter to Nathaniel's descendants in Massachusetts described the journey in vivid detail. The rivers run swift and wide. Forests rise like walls, and every step demands strength, patience, and courage. But the soil here is rich, and there's room enough for men who are willing to toil. James's words sparked a chain reaction. Cousins debated, planned, and eventually followed, some to Missouri, others to Illinois, and a few as far as the emerging cities on the Mississippi. Migration brought more than fertile land, it brought encounters, sometimes violent, with the people already living there. Native tribes, who had survived the push westward for decades, now faced an unrelenting wave of settlers. James wrote cautiously of skirmishes, sometimes brief, sometimes bloody. "We do not seek war," he insisted, "yet there are those who resist. Our land is as dear to them as ours is to us, yet the government encourages us to press forward." Nathaniel's Massachusetts branch, now managing the orchard and trade. Read these accounts with mixed feelings, pride at the family's courage, but worry over the moral and human cost. Meanwhile, the national stage roared with change. The annexation of Texas in 1845 and the subsequent Mexican-American War shifted attention to the southern and western borders. Several Whitfields, eager for both adventure and service, enlisted. Letters from the front lines described long marches under the blazing sun, skirmishes across deserts and rivers, and the terror of artillery fire. Young James returned from Mexico with a limp, the letters noting both his bravery and the price of ambition. "War," he wrote, "is as harsh as any wilderness, yet it shapes a man as surely as plow shapes a field." Back east, Massachusetts and Ohio branches of the family watched the rise of the abolitionist movement with keen interest. Newspapers circulated stories of debates in Congress, the publication of The Liberator, and the growing voices demanding freedom for enslaved Americans. Thomas Whitfield's grandchildren debated these issues hotly at the orchard table. Some argued for gradual emancipation, others demanded immediate action. The Whitfields were united in principle. Liberty, once won through revolution, must not be denied to any human being. Yet disagreements over strategy mirrored the growing national divide, a prelude to conflicts that would later tear families and the country apart. The decade also witnessed the lure of gold and the fever it brought. Though the California gold rush officially erupted in 1848, stories of mineral wealth traveled slowly eastward, carried by miners, merchants, and fortune seekers. James and other frontier Whitfields debated the risk. One letter from Missouri described men abandoning farms for rivers and hills. "Panning and digging for stones that glitter like sun on water," he wrote. Some cousins followed. Not for the riches alone, but for the thrill of testing themselves against unknown lands. Technology reshaped daily life alongside migration. Steamboats plied the Mississippi, carrying goods and people faster than horses could traverse the muddy roads. Railroads began to thread through emerging towns, hinting at a future where distances would shrink, and commerce could move with unprecedented speed. The Whitfields, both merchants and farmers, saw opportunities as well as challenges. Goods could travel farther, but competition and risk also increased. Letters described heated business negotiations, threats from new competitors, and the constant need to innovate or perish. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe ended the Mexican-American War, extending American borders to the Pacific. Some Whitfields, hearing of new land and opportunity, began to plan journeys even farther west. Missouri and Illinois were no longer edges. They were now stepping stones to unknown territories. As families moved, the old orchard in Massachusetts became a symbolic anchor, a place to which some returned, a memory that reminded all of roots, heritage, and the enduring values of hard work and liberty. Not all was progress and optimism. The westward push, the war, and political conflicts brought real dangers. Accidents on rivers, illness on the frontier, and skirmishes with those defending their lands claimed lives. Letters home sometimes arrived with grief, sometimes with hope. Nathaniel's grandchildren, now grown, carried both the pioneering spirit and a cautionary respect for the costs it demanded. By 1850, the Whitfields had become emblematic of a nation in motion. Families scattered, yet connected, striving and enduring, bound by courage and principle. The orchard, though aging, still produced fruit, and the Massachusetts farm remained a haven for those who returned from the western frontier. Across Ohio, Missouri, and beyond, Whitfields had planted roots in new soil, shaping the land even as the land shaped them. The decade closed with a sense of both accomplishment and foreboding. America's borders had expanded, commerce flourished, and technology hinted at a future of unprecedented growth. Yet tensions over slavery, westward settlement, the distribution of power simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the spark that would ignite the next storm. The Whitfields, heirs of revolution and pioneers of expansion, stood at the edge of this new age, ready to face whatever trials it would bring. The orchard in Massachusetts remained a quiet witness, its branches heavy with apples, its roots deep in the soil of liberty. Watching the family and the nation press forward into a century of challenge and promise, the looming conflict, 1850-1860. The 1850s arrived with a tense hush across the United States, a decade in which whispers of division became roars that even the Whitfields could not ignore. The Massachusetts orchard, once a place of serene labor and laughter, now echoed with debates that mirrored the nation's growing turbulence. Families gathered around the hearth, not only to share bread and cider, but to discuss the papers that arrived each week, detailing laws, protests, and conflicts that tugged the country apart. The Compromise of 1850 had attempted to stitch together a fragile union, California admitted as a free state, Texas boundaries resolved, and a strict fugitive slave law imposed to appease the South. Yet the law that forced citizens to aid in the capture of escaped enslaved people outraged many in Massachusetts, including the Whitfields. Young Thomas Whitfield, now grown and married, refused to turn away fugitives who arrived at their farm. He hid them in barns and secret rooms, teaching his own children that liberty was not a mere word on parchment, but a duty to protect the vulnerable. Letters from Ohio and Missouri cousins describe similar efforts, though at great risk. Neighbors who defied laws faced fines, jail, even mob violence. "Freedom is worth danger," Thomas wrote, "and fear must not guide our hands." Across the family, debates grew sharper. Some cousins argued for caution, believing that defying the law could destroy the fragile union. Others, inspired by abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, insisted that moral obligation outweighed legal edict. Around the orchard table, Thomas and Joseph Whitfield spoke with fire and conviction. "If we do nothing," Joseph said, "then we betray every sacrifice made by Nathaniel and Samuel and Thomas before us. Liberty is meaningless if we do not defend it." Nathaniel's eldest grandchildren, who had been raised on tales of the Revolution and frontier struggle, nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of history pressing upon their choices. Meanwhile, the nation's politics became ever more fractious. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 inflamed passions, allowing settlers to determine whether new territories would permit slavery. Violence erupted in Kansas, nicknamed Bleeding Kansas, as pro- and anti-slavery settlers clashed with deadly force. Samuel Whitfield's descendants, who had moved westward decades earlier, wrote of neighbors fighting in the streets, of families torn apart, of communities held hostage to ideology and greed. The Whitfields felt both horror and responsibility. Letters and telegraphs flew back and forth, advice, warnings, and pleas to stay vigilant yet humane. Beyond politics, life continued to press the Whitfields. Farms needed tending, orchards pruned, mills maintained. The younger generation, born into relative peace, now grappled with moral and physical challenges that tested both courage and ingenuity. Joseph's son, Henry, ran a small cider press and taught apprentices the craft. Even as he read newspapers filled with sectional tensions, "The world is changing faster than these barrels can fill," he remarked to his sister, "and yet we must continue our work, as our fathers did, or everything falls apart." Technology, commerce, and travel continued to reshape life. Railroads spread like iron veins across Ohio and Missouri, connecting previously distant settlements, bringing news, people, and ideas. Steamboats carried goods along the Mississippi with unprecedented speed. With these innovations came both opportunity and peril. Markets could expand, but so could conflict. Families, like the Whitfields, who had branches across the continent, relied on faster communication to maintain ties. Often racing to respond to crises or political developments before events overtook them. Amid this turbulence, the Whitfields also felt the pull of personal ambition and identity. Young women like Mary Whitfield, Samuel's granddaughter, began speaking publicly at abolitionist gatherings in Ohio and Massachusetts, challenging gender norms while championing human rights. Her speeches inspired family and neighbors alike, yet drew criticism from some who feared the mixing of politics and propriety. The orchard became a place of discussion and preparation for activism, the scent of apples mingling with the ideas of justice and liberty. Religion, too, played a role. Churches, which had long been the center of community life, now hosted debates over morality, slavery, and national destiny. The Whitfields attended services not only for worship but to witness, and sometimes participate in, these vital discussions. Ministers preached both caution and courage. Some urged compromise, others demanded defiance against injustice. The family listened carefully, recognizing that faith, like freedom, required both reflection and action. As the decade progressed, the Whitfields faced their own internal conflicts. Disagreements over politics and slavery sometimes strained relationships, mirroring the tensions tearing at the national fabric. Yet shared history, labor, and love kept them connected. Family councils were held beneath the orchard, where elders shared stories of the Revolution and frontier life, reminding younger generations of sacrifice and perseverance. "Every choice has weight," Thomas Whitfield reminded them one summer evening. "But our loyalty must first be to conscience and courage, as it was for Nathaniel and Samuel before us." By 1860, the storm that had been gathering across decades darkened the horizon visibly. Abraham Lincoln's election, though hailed in Massachusetts, enraged southern states, and the threat of secession loomed. The Whitfields, now spanning multiple states, received letters from cousins in Kentucky and Missouri describing fear, uncertainty, and sometimes outright defiance. "It seems," Joseph wrote, "that we have fought for freedom only to see it challenged from within. Yet we must remain steadfast, as our ancestors did, for liberty demands vigilance." The decade closed with the Whitfields acutely aware that the nation's unity was fragile. The orchard, still fruitful, stood as a symbol of endurance, its branches reaching outward. Just as the family had survived revolution, expansion, and frontier challenges, so too would they need courage and wisdom for the trials that now loomed. The Whitfields understood that the coming years would test them in ways they could scarcely imagine, but they were determined, as always, to meet history with resolve, labor, and the lessons passed down through generations. The 1850s ended in tension, hope, and preparation. Across the nation, states bristled with argument and fear, yet the Whitfields held fast to their principles. Liberty, justice, and family ties were their anchor. And as the winds of conflict gathered, they knew that they and the nation would soon be called to their ultimate test. Civil War erupts 1861 to 1865. The year 1861 arrived like a thunderclap, shaking every corner of the United States. The storm the Whitfields had sensed for decades now broke into open conflict. Secession had fractured the Union, and the drums of war echoed from South Carolina to Massachusetts, from Ohio to Missouri. Families across the nation faced impossible choices: which side to serve, what beliefs to defend, and whether kin could survive the coming chaos. The Whitfields, spread across multiple states, felt the weight of history and blood pressing upon them all at once. Young Thomas Whitfield, grandson of Nathaniel, had long believed in the principles his forebears had cherished: liberty, justice, and the protection of the vulnerable. When Lincoln called for troops after Fort Sumter, Thomas enlisted immediately, joining a Massachusetts regiment bound for Virginia. Letters from the front described the march through muddy fields and dense forests, the crack of musket fire, and the roar of cannon that shook the earth. In quiet moments, he wrote home of the human cost: Friends struck down, towns burned, hospitals overflowing with wounded. War, he confessed in a letter to his sister Mary, is not a tale of glory, but of endurance, courage, and sorrow beyond imagining. In Ohio and Missouri, cousins faced equally perilous choices. Some enlisted for the Union. Others found themselves torn between community ties and conscience. Samuel Whitfield's son Caleb refused to fight against the Union, but struggled as neighbors in Missouri joined Confederate ranks. Letters detailed nights spent hiding, debates with neighbors over loyalty, and the anguish of seeing families divided by ideology. The Whitfields learned firsthand that civil war was not only fought on fields and rivers, it lived in hearts and homes, sometimes splitting even those bound by blood. Back in Massachusetts, the orchard became a place of preparation and support. Joseph Whitfield organized shipments of food, clothing, and medical supplies to soldiers in the field. Young women sewed uniforms, tended gardens for extra produce, and wrote letters of encouragement. The family's labor became a quiet front of its own, sustaining men and morale alike. Mary Whitfield, now a young woman with a powerful voice, joined abolitionist groups to advocate for the freedom of enslaved people, even as bullets flew far south. Her speeches inspired cousins and neighbors, linking home efforts to the moral cause of the war. Battles raged with brutal intensity. From Bull Run to Antietam, Gettysburg to Vicksburg, the Whitfields followed news with a mixture of fear and awe. Thomas described the carnage of Shiloh in letters home, the rivers of mud and blood, the cries of the dying, and the bravery of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstance. The farm in Massachusetts waited patiently. Trees bearing fruit season after season, yet every harvest was shadowed by worry. Families prayed beneath branches that had witnessed generations rise and fall, seeking solace from nature while the nation itself tore apart. Medical hardship compounded the horrors. Soldiers returned wounded, scarred, and ill. Letters described infections, amputations, and the anguish of those left behind. The Whitfields' knowledge of farming, healing herbs, and community care became indispensable. Homes became temporary hospitals, kitchens became apothecaries, and the orchard's shade offered respite to weary men and women. Each act of care mirrored the principles Nathaniel had championed: service, courage, and moral responsibility. The war also forced difficult moral decisions. Thomas Whitfield once sheltered a group of escaped enslaved people traveling north along the Underground Railroad. Risking both reputation and law, he guided them to safety in Canada. Letters recounted nights spent hidden in barns, the fear of discovery, and the quiet triumph of freedom achieved. The Whitfields understood that courage required both conviction and action, and that liberty demanded sacrifice in ways both small and monumental. By 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation reshaped the moral landscape of the conflict. Thomas wrote with fervor to Ohio cousins, describing the promise of freedom for millions, yet lamenting that battles continued, lives were lost, and hatred endured. The Whitfields took solace in the growing moral clarity. The war was no longer solely about union, but about the very soul of the nation. The orchard, ever resilient, became a symbol of endurance and hope, its fruit a testament to survival amidst chaos. Loss was inevitable. Cousins and friends fell in battles across Virginia, Tennessee, and Mississippi. Some letters never arrived. Others carried the final words of the departed. At the Massachusetts farmhouse, grief was tempered by action, planting gardens to feed soldiers, knitting socks and blankets, and organizing community prayers. The family drew strength from tradition, from labor, and from belief in the ultimate justice of the cause. In Missouri and Ohio, the Whitfields faced divided communities, where loyalties were tested, and neighbor sometimes opposed neighbor. Caleb Whitfield recounted ambushes, threats, and the constant tension of living in contested territories. Yet even there, courage persisted. Hidden messages, smuggled food, and quiet acts of defiance kept hope alive. Letters between East and West branches carried stories of perseverance, reminding all that family principle and the enduring fight for freedom were stronger than fear. By 1865, the war drew to a close. The Union endured, slavery was abolished, and the nation, though bruised and scarred, survived. Thomas Whitfield returned to Massachusetts, his eyes carrying the weight of what he had witnessed. The orchard welcomed him home, its branches heavy with fruit, the soil fertile yet marked by the labor of generations. Across the country, the Whitfields began rebuilding not only farms and homes, but lives, communities, and a nation. The decade of the 1860s left the Whitfields forever changed. They had faced the horrors of war, the moral challenges of slavery, and the deep divisions of a country in turmoil. Yet they had endured, guided by the principles Nathaniel and Samuel had instilled: courage, conscience, labor, and love for liberty. The orchard, a witness to generations, stood as a living memorial, roots deep, its branches reaching skyward, resilient against every storm. As the nation entered Reconstruction, the Whitfields knew the challenges were far from over. But they also knew that, like the apple trees planted generations ago, growth required tending, patience, and care. Freedom, justice, and family, these were the seeds they would continue to nurture, no matter what storms lay ahead. Reconstruction and renewal, 1865 to 1880. The war had ended. But the echoes of its thunder lingered in every corner of American life. For the Whitfields, peace arrived with relief, sorrow, and responsibility. Massachusetts and Ohio had been spared the worst devastation of battle, but every family carried scars. Fathers, sons, and neighbors lost, farms and communities shaken, ideals tested and redefined. The orchard in Massachusetts, still bearing fruit despite the upheavals, became both a symbol and a sanctuary. Thomas Whitfield returned home to the farmhouse in 1865, his uniform tattered, his hands calloused, and his spirit tempered by sorrow. He found solace beneath the apple trees, whose roots had weathered storms for generations. The orchard offered more than sustenance. It offered a reminder of continuity, of life persisting despite devastation. Thomas worked tirelessly, pruning, planting, and grafting, seeing in each branch a lesson about resilience. What survives the storm, if nurtured, can flourish anew. Reconstruction across the nation brought both promise and challenge. Freedmen in the South sought justice, education, and opportunity, while many former Confederates resisted change with resentment and violence. The Whitfields followed the news closely, discussing policy, morality, and the future of a united nation at the family table. Joseph Whitfield, now elder in the Massachusetts branch, often remarked, "The nation's wounds are deep. We cannot heal them with haste. Patience, persistence, and principle must guide our hands, as they always have." Meanwhile, the younger Whitfields looked westward once more. James Whitfield's family, established in Missouri, took advantage of new railroads and river trade to expand farms and businesses. Rail lines connected their settlements to Chicago and St. Louis, allowing goods from grain to cider to reach distant markets. Life was no longer purely agricultural. Commerce, industry, and invention reshaped opportunity. Letters from the Western Whitfields describe steamboats plying the Mississippi, telegraph lines bringing news faster than horses, and the first glimmers of mechanized farming. Progress promised prosperity, but demanded adaptation. Education and civic engagement became central in post-war life. Mary Whitfield, who had spoken passionately against slavery, continued her work in Massachusetts, founding schools and advocating for broader access to education. Her lectures, letters, and community projects inspired younger Whitfields to value learning, civic responsibility, and moral leadership. Across Ohio and Missouri, cousins established schools and libraries, believing that knowledge was both a safeguard and a bridge to a stronger, united nation. Economic recovery was neither uniform nor simple. While the Massachusetts orchard thrived and Ohio farms expanded, some western settlements faced floods, crop failures, and unpredictable markets. The Whitfields learned to diversify: grain, fruit, livestock, and small-scale manufacturing became intertwined with commerce. Business acumen blended with traditional labor, reflecting the adaptability that had defined the family for generations. "The land gives," Joseph wrote, "but we must work wisely, or it will take back in kind." Industrial growth reshaped not only economics, but society. Factories rose in cities, powered by steam engines and later electricity. Railroads stitched the nation together, reducing isolation and opening markets. The Whitfields, though rooted in agriculture, could not ignore these changes. Some younger cousins took apprenticeships in urban trades, traveling to Boston, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. Letters described the roar of machinery, the smoke-stained skies, and the thrill of invention. Tempered by recognition of the challenges facing workers and communities in a rapidly changing landscape. Social reform movements continued to inspire and challenge the Whitfields. Women's suffrage, temperance, and labor rights became prominent topics of discussion. Mary and other female relatives organized meetings, petitions, and lectures, teaching the next generation to balance principle with practical action. The orchard became a meeting place for ideas, as much as for labor, a space where moral philosophy met tangible work, where freedom was not only political but lived daily in justice, fairness, and effort. The decade also brought personal joys and trials. Marriages, births, and the growth of new households kept the family vibrant, yet illness and loss were reminders of life's fragility. Epidemics of cholera and smallpox periodically swept communities. Accidents on farms and in towns were common. The Whitfields faced these with pragmatism and compassion, blending medical knowledge, care, and community support. Each recovery, each act of tending the sick or wounded, reinforced the family's values, courage, labor, and moral responsibility. By 1880, the Whitfields had transformed alongside the nation. The orchard remained a central symbol, a place of continuity amidst change. Branches bore fruit that nourished both body and spirit, reminding all generations of the endurance, diligence, principles that had carried their forebears through revolution, expansion, civil war, and reconstruction. The family, now spread across states and engaged in diverse pursuits, remained connected by shared history. Letters and visits, always returning to the Massachusetts orchard as an anchor. The nation, too, was changing. Cities expanded, railroads and canals knit distant lands together, and industry promised both wealth and upheaval. Social and political tensions persisted, particularly regarding the rights of freed people, women, and laborers. The Whitfields, mindful of history, navigated these shifts with prudence and courage, knowing that the lessons of previous generations, endurance, principle, and moral clarity would guide them through new challenges. As the 1880s approached, the Whitfields looked forward with tempered optimism. They had endured storms of revolution, expansion, war, and social change. They had witnessed the power of liberty, the cost of conflict, and the rewards of perseverance. And in every generation, they had cultivated not only the land, but the principles of family, labor, and conscience. The orchard stood as both metaphor and reality, a living testament to resilience, rooted deeply in soil, nourished by labor, and reaching ever toward the sky. The Whitfield story, like America itself, was far from finished. But as the decade closed, they knew that growth, renewal, principle could guide them forward through every storm, every challenge, and every triumph yet to come. The age of industry, 1880 to 1900, the final 2 decades of the 19th century, arrived as a whirlwind of change, industry, and opportunity. America, once a nation of farms and frontiers, now pulsed with the rhythm of factories, railroads, and bustling cities. For the Whitfields, the orchard in Massachusetts remained a grounding place, a tangible connection to the past. Yet the family had grown, spread, and diversified, their lives now intertwined with the sweeping transformations shaping the nation itself. Thomas Whitfield's grandchildren, who had survived the turbulence of war and Reconstruction, now faced the promise and perils of industrialization. Young men and women left the orchard for cities like Boston, Cincinnati, and Chicago, drawn by the allure of steady work, education, and innovation. Some entered factories, learning the operations of looms, presses, and machines that could produce in hours what once took days by hand. Others pursued trade, finance, or transportation, recognizing that railroads, canals, and telegraphs had made the country smaller, faster, and interconnected in unprecedented ways. The Massachusetts orchard remained a touchstone. Every summer, cousins returned to the familiar scent of apple blossoms, the rustle of leaves, and the quiet of laboring hands in sun-warmed soil. Here, elders reminded the younger generation of principles rooted in centuries of struggle, diligence, integrity, and moral responsibility. "The world changes," Joseph Whitfield would say, leaning on a polished cane, "but character and courage endure. Remember, the trees you tend teach lessons no machine can replace." Industry transformed daily life. Railroads crisscrossed the country, carrying goods, letters, and people farther and faster than ever before. The Mississippi and Ohio rivers teemed with steamboats transporting crops, timber, and manufactured goods. Young Whitfields in Missouri and Illinois expanded farms into commercial operations, leveraging rail connections to bring cider, grains, and livestock to distant markets. Technological innovation offered both opportunity and risk. Misjudged investments or crop failures could bring ruin as swiftly as success could bring fortune. Urban life demanded adaptation. Boston's streets were filled with noise, smoke, and commerce, a contrast to the quiet rhythms of the orchard. Mary Whitfield, now a woman of influence and vision, organized schools, libraries, and civic programs for the growing population of immigrant children. Believing that education was the cornerstone of a responsible and thriving democracy, her letters to relatives in Ohio and Missouri detailed classrooms, lectures, and community debates, reminding all that progress required not only industry but moral engagement. Labor challenges grew alongside prosperity. Factories employed hundreds, often under harsh conditions. Strikes, protests, and political debates tested local governance and civic resolve. The Whitfields engaged with these changes pragmatically, balancing economic growth with fairness. In Ohio, Caleb Whitfield advocated for safe working conditions on newly mechanized farms and mills, blending practical labor oversight with ethical responsibility. Across the family, letters debated the balance of wealth, duty, and justice in a rapidly modernizing nation. Technological advances reshaped communication and culture. The telegraph allowed news to travel instantly. Newspapers and magazines flourished, spreading ideas and information to rural and urban communities alike. Whitfields across states exchanged detailed letters and telegrams, connecting generations despite distance. The orchard remained the anchor, a place where ideas could be shared in person. Yet technology allowed the family to remain intertwined with national events, commerce, and social movements. Social reform remained central. Women's suffrage gained momentum, labor rights became pressing, and education expanded. Mary Whitfield and other cousins pushed for change, founding schools and advocating civic responsibility. The family understood that industrial growth must be accompanied by moral vigilance. Wealth and machines could not alone create a just society. Principles of fairness, diligence, and service remained as important as ever. The decade also brought challenges unique to the age of industry. Economic depressions, such as the Panic of 1893, reminded the Whitfields that growth could be precarious. Farms and businesses sometimes failed. Cities struggled with unemployment and poverty, yet resilience, a defining trait of the family for generations, prevailed. They relied on community, skill, and foresight, adapting to new conditions while preserving the values that had guided Nathaniel, Samuel, and Thomas through revolution, expansion, and war. By 1900, the Whitfields had become emblematic of a nation in transition. Some remained rooted in agriculture, blending tradition with new commerce. Others had embraced urban life, industry, and education. The orchard, though aged, continued to bear fruit, symbolizing continuity amidst upheaval. Families gathered there each season, sharing stories, labor, and guidance, ensuring that each generation understood the lessons of history, even as they faced the demands of modernity. The country itself had transformed. Railroads, telegraphs, and factories connected the continent. Cities thrived. Social movements challenged inequality. America was no longer merely a nation of farms and frontiers. It was an industrial power, a society of opportunity and struggle bound together by shared ideals and the legacy of generations who had endured conflict, hardship, and change. The Whitfields in every branch carried the same lessons: labor, conscience, courage, and family. The orchard, the letters, and the shared work of generations reminded them that progress without principle was hollow. The past remained a guide, the present a challenge, and the future a call to adapt and persevere. As the century turned, the Whitfields' farmers, merchants, educators, and innovators stood, ready to embrace the next era. They understood that industry, technology, and commerce were powerful tools, but only values rooted in history, morality, and family could ensure their enduring benefit. The orchard remained a sanctuary, a witness to generations, its roots deep, its branches reaching upward, resilient through storm, war, and change. The new century and American identity, 1900 to 1920. The dawn of the 20th century arrived with a sense of anticipation, innovation, and challenge. For the Whitfields, the orchard in Massachusetts remained a cherished anchor, but the world beyond its branches had grown fast and complex. Cities rose like towers of steel and brick, railroads crisscrossed the continent, and industry pulsed with energy. The family spread across multiple states, embraced both tradition and progress, seeking ways to honor the past while navigating the opportunities and trials of modern life. Thomas Whitfield's grandchildren, now adults, were a generation of pioneers not in the wilderness but in commerce, education, and civic life. Some worked in factories, mastering new machinery. Others became teachers, lawyers, or entrepreneurs. Yet every summer the orchard called them back, its familiar scent of apples and soil grounding them in family history. The orchard served as a place of reflection, storytelling, and teaching, a tangible reminder of the values that had sustained the family through revolution, expansion, war, and industrial transformation. The nation itself was transforming. Immigration swelled cities with new workers, ideas, and cultures. Boston, Chicago, and Cincinnati became centers of labor, trade, and social activism. Mary Whitfield, now a respected community leader, organized schools for children of immigrants, advocating literacy, civic responsibility, and moral guidance. Letters from her to cousins across the country emphasized the importance of education and engagement. A nation grows not only through wealth or land but through the minds and hearts of its citizens. Teach well, and the future will flourish. Social reform movements surged. Women's suffrage gained momentum, culminating in organized campaigns for voting rights. Labor unions fought for fair wages and safer working conditions. The Whitfields engaged actively, balancing principle with pragmatism. In Ohio, Caleb Whitfield helped organize worker cooperatives and community schools. In Massachusetts, Thomas and Joseph's descendants supported initiatives that improved sanitation, education, and civic participation. Across the branches, the family recognized that modernity demanded moral vigilance as much as technical skill. The international stage also influenced the family. The outbreak of World War I in 1914, and later American involvement in 1917, cast shadows across homes, farms, and factories. Thomas Whitfield's great-grandchildren enlisted or contributed to war efforts through manufacturing, nursing, and civic programs. Letters from France and Germany described the horrors of modern warfare, artillery, trenches, and the unprecedented scale of suffering. Back home, families tended to local economies, supported troops, and engaged in patriotic and humanitarian work. The orchard continued to provide sustenance and solace, a quiet refuge amidst global turmoil. Industrial growth accelerated. Factories, railroads, and new technologies changed the pace of life. The Whitfields adapted, balancing traditional farming with business ventures and urban centers. Grain, livestock, and fruit from Ohio and Massachusetts now reached distant markets by rail and steamship. Mechanized farming tools increased efficiency, yet required careful planning and management. The family's adaptability, a trait nurtured for generations, became crucial as old skills met new demands. Cultural shifts were equally profound. Art, literature, and music flourished in cities, influencing education and daily life. The younger Whitfields embraced cultural literacy alongside professional and practical skills. Theater, newspapers, and public lectures shaped opinions and broadened horizons. Mary Whitfield's initiatives often combined culture and education, hosting reading circles, public lectures, and debates on ethics, history, and civic responsibility. These gatherings reinforced the family's principle that knowledge, moral courage, and community engagement were inseparable. Despite growth and modernization, challenges persisted. Epidemics, economic fluctuations, and labor disputes tested the family and communities. The Spanish influenza of 1918 struck fear and illness into every household. The Whitfields, drawing on centuries of experience with farming, medicine, and communal care. Organized aid, isolation, and relief efforts. Letters recounting nights spent tending the sick, transporting supplies, and comforting the afflicted reflected the family's enduring dedication to service and resilience. By 1920, the nation had changed profoundly. Women gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. Cities thrived, industry expanded, and the global stage demanded engagement and vigilance. The Whitfields spread across Massachusetts, Ohio, and Missouri, navigated this new world with confidence rooted in history. They understood that freedom, education, and civic responsibility were the foundation of progress, and that labor, moral integrity, family ties were essential to sustaining both community and nation. The orchard, timeless and enduring, continued to bear fruit. It had witnessed centuries of challenge, triumph, and adaptation. From colonial times through revolution, frontier expansion, civil war, reconstruction, and industrialization. Each branch, leaf, and root carried the lessons of generations: courage, conscience, labor, and loyalty. The orchard reminded every Whitfield, young and old, that while the world changes rapidly, the principles that sustain families and nations endure. As the United States embraced the roaring decade of the 1920s, the Whitfields prepared to face a modern world of innovation, complexity, and opportunity. Though it survived and thrived through centuries of upheaval, and now as new inventions. Cultural shifts and global connections reshaped life. They knew that the lessons of their ancestors would guide them. Resilience in the face of adversity, dedication to family, and unwavering commitment to principle. The orchard remained their compass, steady and enduring. Its roots, planted by forebears who had crossed oceans and frontiers, sustained them. Its branches reached ever forward, a symbol of continuity, hope, and the enduring power of history and family. The Whitfields stood ready, as always, to meet the challenges and promise of a new century with courage, diligence, and unwavering moral clarity. The Roaring Twenties and Modern Challenges. 1920 to 1930. The 1920s arrived like a whirlwind, a decade of dazzling change, boundless energy, and shifting norms. Jazz filled city streets, automobiles replaced horse-drawn carriages, and electricity transformed homes, factories, and farms. The Whitfields, the Massachusetts orchard, remained a constant, a living reminder of roots and tradition. Yet the family, now spread across cities and states, felt the pulse of a nation moving faster than ever before. Young Whitfields in Boston and Chicago embraced urban life, attending universities, working in offices, factories, and banks. They marveled at skyscrapers rising like monuments to ambition, automobiles zipping along asphalt roads, and radios bringing news, music, and ideas into living rooms across the country. Letters home described dazzling spectacles, from Broadway theaters to local jazz clubs, revealing a generation excited by opportunity, yet aware of the challenges that modernization brought. In Massachusetts, the orchard continued to bear fruit, sustaining both family and local commerce. Thomas and Joseph Whitfield's descendants managed the land with care, integrating modern agricultural practices alongside tradition. Fertilizers, improved irrigation, and mechanized tools increased efficiency. Yet the orchard remained more than a business. It was a symbol of continuity amidst rapid societal change. Family members returned each season to harvest apples, graft new trees, and teach younger generations the skills and principles that had guided the Whitfields for centuries. Social change accelerated. Women, empowered by suffrage, began to assert influence in politics, education, and civic life. Mary Whitfield's descendants led initiatives in schools, libraries, and local government, advocating literacy, civic responsibility, and equal opportunity. Across Ohio and Missouri, the Whitfields encouraged participation in community projects, demonstrating that progress required both action and principle. The family balanced tradition with modernity, teaching that advancement was meaningful only when rooted in ethics and responsibility. Economic prosperity defined much of the decade, yet disparities persisted. Urban workers faced long hours in factories, while farmers navigated fluctuating crop prices. Caleb Whitfield, in Ohio, organized cooperatives to support farmers, ensuring fair access to markets and supplies. Letters described the tension between opportunity and risk, highlighting the necessity of prudence alongside ambition. The Whitfields understood that prosperity, without planning and moral guidance, could be fleeting. Technology reshaped communication and culture. Radios, telegraphs, and newspapers connected Whitfields across states in real time, allowing letters to carry not only news but guidance and counsel. Education expanded, with many younger cousins attending high school and university, embracing professional careers while maintaining ties to family in the orchard. The rapid flow of information challenged the family to remain grounded in principle, even as the pace of life accelerated. The decade was also marked by cultural experimentation and challenge to norms. Jazz, cinema, and literature transformed the public imagination. Whitfield cousins attended concerts, performances, and lectures, discussing ideas of art, society, and morality. While some embraced these innovations enthusiastically, elders cautioned balance, urging reflection on the lessons of the past. Diligence, ethical behavior, and familial responsibility remained paramount. Despite prosperity, warning signs emerged. Agricultural prices fell, banks took risks, and speculation surged in stock markets. The Whitfields, mindful of history, prepared for uncertainty. Ohio farms diversified crops, Massachusetts orchards, strengthened business ties, and urban relatives invested cautiously. The family's ability to balance optimism with prudence reflected a century of experience. From revolution through civil war to industrial growth, prohibition brought both opportunity and challenge. Some cousins saw business in the era of illicit trade, while others adhered strictly to law and morality. Discussions at the orchard, in letters, and during family gatherings emphasized responsibility, conscience, and ethical action. The Whitfields navigated social experimentation with clarity, reinforcing principles that had guided generations: character, labor, and moral courage. By 1930, the decade of exhilaration drew to a close, shadowed by warning signs of economic collapse. The stock market faltered, farmers struggled with falling prices, and families across the nation braced for uncertainty. The Whitfields, however, were better prepared than many. Rooted in centuries of resilience, they relied on diversified skills, strong family networks, and prudence to weather the coming storm. The orchard, ever enduring, symbolized continuity amidst volatility. It had witnessed generations of Whitfields navigating revolution, expansion, war, industrialization, and social change. Its roots remained deep, its branches resilient, and its fruit a reminder that labor, principle, and family sustained life even in the most turbulent times. The Roaring Twenties had brought opportunity, excitement, and modern challenges. The Whitfields emerged with experience, wisdom, and preparation, ready to face the decade to come, the Great Depression, with the same courage, integrity, and endurance that had guided them through centuries. The Great Depression and resilience. 1930 to 1940. The year 1930 opened under a darkening sky for America. The stock market crash of 1929 had sent shockwaves through cities, towns, and farms alike. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and families faced unprecedented uncertainty. For the Whitfields, the orchard in Massachusetts, the farms in Ohio, and the small businesses scattered across the Midwest became both a lifeline and a test of endurance. The lessons of previous generations, resilience, prudence, and moral courage, would be more essential than ever. Thomas Whitfield's great-grandchildren, now young adults, faced the economic turmoil with determination. The Massachusetts orchard, which had sustained the family for centuries, became a critical source of stability. While urban relatives struggled with job losses and financial uncertainty, the orchard produced apples, cider, and preserves that could be sold or traded locally. The Whitfields leaned on their labor, knowledge of the land, and community networks to weather the initial shocks, demonstrating that long-cultivated skills and prudence were invaluable during crisis. In Ohio, Caleb Whitfield and his siblings coordinated with neighbors to create cooperative farming networks. Crops were shared, equipment pooled, and produce bartered when cash was scarce. Families relied on these informal safety nets to survive, reinforcing the principle that strength lay in community as much as in individual effort. Letters sent back to Massachusetts described the hardships: barren fields, low market prices, and the despair of seeing neighbors struggle. Yet even amidst the struggle, the Whitfields focused on solutions rather than despair. Drawing inspiration from ancestors who had faced revolution, civil war, and economic upheaval. Urban Whitfields, facing factory layoffs and reduced wages, adapted by diversifying work. Some took on temporary jobs, others relied on skill trades, and many engaged in civic or charitable projects to support neighbors in need. Mary Whitfield's descendants, continuing a family tradition of social engagement. Organized local food drives, education programs, and informal schools for children whose families could no longer afford formal tuition. These efforts reinforced the Whitfields' enduring principle that adversity demanded not only endurance, but active service to community. Economic hardship transformed social dynamics. Families who had once relied on cash income found new ways to barter and share resources. Clothing, tools, and food were exchanged. Skills were shared freely. Whitfields became central figures in these networks, using decades of accumulated knowledge and experience to assist others. Their efforts were guided by a simple principle passed down from Nathaniel and Samuel: labor and conscience were inseparable. Every task, from tending orchards to teaching children to sew or read, was imbued with purpose. Nationally, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs arrived mid-decade, offering relief, jobs, and optimism. The Whitfields engaged with initiatives like the Civilian Conservation Corps, agricultural subsidies, and public works projects. Farms received aid to improve irrigation, repair infrastructure, and diversify production. Urban relatives found employment opportunities in government-sponsored projects. These programs complemented the family's efforts, but the Whitfields also recognized that preparation, labor, and community support were the real keys to survival. Despite hardship, life continued with resilience and creativity. Festivals, community gatherings, and church events remained focal points for maintaining morale. In Massachusetts, the orchard hosted annual harvest celebrations where apples were pressed into cider, preserves prepared, and stories of past generations shared with the young. These gatherings reinforced continuity, reminding each generation that even in hardship, labor and cooperation could produce sustenance, joy, and hope. Education and self-improvement remained priorities. Even when families lacked resources, Whitfields continued teaching reading, arithmetic, and vocational skills to younger generations. Mary Whitfield's community programs emphasized literacy, practical knowledge, and civic responsibility, ensuring that the lessons of history, perseverance, morality, and service remained relevant despite economic despair. Letters detailed small successes: a student learning to read, a neighbor repairing a fence collaboratively, or a family producing enough food to survive the winter. The decade also tested moral courage. Some relatives faced ethical dilemmas: whether to engage in illegal work to survive, how to support struggling neighbors without exploiting them, and how to maintain honesty in a world of scarcity. Across states, the Whitfields consistently chose integrity, reinforcing the family ethos that moral character was more important than temporary gain. Their choices strengthened both their own resilience and the community bonds that made survival possible. By 1940, the Great Depression had left scars, yet it had also forged strength. The Whitfields had endured unemployment, market collapse, and social upheaval with adaptability, cooperation, and determination. Massachusetts orchards thrived. Ohio farms remained productive, and urban relatives found new footholds in business and community projects. Letters between branches chronicled both hardships and triumphs, ensuring that every generation knew the power of labor, principle, and unity. The orchard, ever steadfast, symbolized endurance. Its roots, deep in centuries of soil, withstood not only storms and wars, but also the upheaval of economic collapse. Its branches bore fruit, a tangible reminder that life, when tended with diligence and principle, could flourish even under the harshest conditions. For the Whitfields, the decade reinforced a simple truth: resilience was cultivated through labor, supported by community, and guided by moral clarity. As America emerged slowly from economic crisis, the Whitfields were prepared for the next challenge: a world inching toward global conflict. They had faced revolution, civil war, industrialization, social change, and economic collapse and survived. The family's enduring principles, courage, conscience, labor, and unity would once again be called upon as the 1940s approached, bringing new trials and the opportunity for heroism, innovation, and service. World War II and global engagement, 1940 to 1945. The 1940s arrived with the ominous rumble of global conflict. Europe was engulfed in war, and Asia simmered in tension. For the United States, neutrality ended abruptly with the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, drawing the nation into the Second World War. The Whitfields, now spanning Massachusetts, Ohio, Missouri, and beyond, faced this challenge with the same resilience, courage, and moral conviction that had guided generations through revolution, civil strife, industrial transformation, and economic hardship. Thomas Whitfield's descendants, now in their prime, responded swiftly. Sons and daughters enlisted in the armed forces, serving in the Army, Navy, and newly formed Air Corps. Letters from training camps and distant theaters of war described grueling routines, technical learning, and the camaraderie forged under pressure. Cousins in Massachusetts and Ohio coordinated local efforts, organizing drives for supplies, rationing initiatives, and correspondence with soldiers overseas. The family's network, stretching across multiple states, became a vital support system. Reflecting a centuries-old principle, collective effort and conscience were as essential as courage. On the home front, the Massachusetts orchard transformed into a hub of contribution. Families intensified production, growing vegetables, preserving fruits, and sending parcels to soldiers abroad. Victory gardens cropped up in towns and neighborhoods, a testament to resourcefulness and patriotism. Mary Whitfield's grandchildren, echoing her lifelong dedication to education and civic engagement, organized local programs to teach sewing, first aid, basic technical skills to support war industries. Every branch of the family, from city apartments to rural farms, mobilized in service, embodying a shared ethic that labor and moral responsibility were inseparable. The theaters of war were vast and unforgiving. Whitfield men and women serving abroad encountered battles in Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa. Letters home described amphibious landings, strategic bombing campaigns, and the harsh realities of trench and jungle warfare. Personal accounts spoke of friendship and loss, fear and courage, and the necessity of discipline and moral clarity under extreme stress. Families at home read these letters with a mix of pride and anxiety, conscious that sacrifice was being paid in both life and spirit. Industrialization, which had transformed the nation in previous decades, became an asset for war production. Factories that once produced consumer goods now manufactured tanks, airplanes, and weapons. Railroads and ports hummed with activity, delivering raw materials and finished equipment to troops overseas. Whitfields and urban centers took jobs in factories, assembly lines, and logistics, while simultaneously maintaining farms and orchards to feed the nation. The family's adaptability, a hallmark across centuries, ensured they contributed both materially and morally to the war effort. Women's roles expanded dramatically. Female Whitfields stepped into professions previously dominated by men, including factory work, clerical positions, and technical training. They managed households, coordinated community support, and trained younger generations in practical skills. Mary Whitfield's lineage, already deeply involved in education and civic engagement, emphasized that competence, courage, and moral guidance were equally essential on the home front, as on distant battlefields. The war also tested ethics and conscience. Some family members faced moral dilemmas in combat, governance, and civic duties. Decisions regarding leadership, rationing, and personal risk required careful reflection, guided by centuries of family principles. Letters and journals revealed debates about fairness, courage, and responsibility, echoing the wisdom of ancestors who had endured revolution, civil war, industrialization, and economic depression. Integrity, as always, remained paramount. News of victory and tragedy arrived simultaneously. The Whitfields mourned lost cousins while celebrating those who returned. The orchard, though quieter, due to wartime labor demands elsewhere, continued to provide sustenance, solace, and continuity. Its enduring presence reminded each generation that life, like the trees they tended, could persist and flourish through storms, conflict, and upheaval. The harvests were shared not only within the family, but with neighbors and local institutions supporting soldiers and displaced families. By 1945, the war drew to a close. Europe and the Pacific bore the scars of unparalleled destruction, yet the Whitfields, like the nation itself, emerged resilient. Returning soldiers brought new skills, experiences, and perspectives. Urban relatives resumed or began civilian careers, contributing to post-war reconstruction and growth. Farms and orchards expanded with improved technology and mechanization, while families reinforced lessons of labor, ethical responsibility, and community service. The Whitfields understood that the war had reshaped America permanently. Industrial strength, global engagement, and social transformation demanded adaptability, courage, and ethical guidance. The orchard remained a touchstone, a living reminder that growth, rooted in principle and nurtured through labor, could survive even the harshest trials. Each generation, from children to elders, recognized that history's lessons were not merely stories, but practical guidance for navigating a world of constant change. As the 1940s ended, the Whitfields stood poised for the post-war era, a time of unprecedented prosperity, innovation, and challenge. They had endured global conflict, economic hardship, and societal transformation. The values instilled through centuries, courage, conscience, labor, and unity ensured that the family would continue to thrive in a modern, interconnected, and rapidly changing world. The orchard, steadfast and enduring, symbolized continuity, hope, and the enduring power of heritage in shaping a family and nation. Post-war prosperity and American expansion, 1945 to 1960. The end of World War II brought a wave of relief, optimism, and opportunity across the United States. Soldiers returned home, families reunited, and the economy surged with unprecedented growth. For the Whitfields, the Massachusetts orchard, Ohio farms, urbane enterprises became both a haven and a platform for renewed ambition. The nation itself seemed to pulse with energy. New homes rose in suburbs, industries expanded, and a sense of possibility hung in the air. Returning Whitfield veterans carried with them the discipline, skills, and experiences acquired in battle. Many pursued higher education through the GI Bill, entering universities and technical schools, while others returned to manage farms, orchards, and businesses. Across Massachusetts, Ohio, and Missouri, the family embraced the post-war economic boom, blending tradition with innovation. The orchard benefited from mechanized equipment, fertilizers, and improved cultivation methods, producing abundant harvests to feed a growing nation. Suburban expansion reshaped family life. New homes, schools, and neighborhoods created communities distinct from urban centers and rural farms. Whitfield families adapted, building residences that balanced comfort with practicality, creating networks of support and shared values in these new environments. Family gatherings, summer orchard visits, and coordinated events reinforced the sense of continuity and heritage that had sustained the Whitfields for generations. The post-war era also heralded technological and cultural transformations. Automobiles became ubiquitous, highways connected states, and domestic appliances transformed daily life. The orchard, while rooted in tradition, incorporated these innovations. Tractors, irrigation systems, and processing equipment increased efficiency, allowing family members to explore new ventures while maintaining agricultural heritage. Letters between branches reflected excitement over innovations, balanced with recognition that labor, diligence, and principle remained essential. Education and civic engagement flourished. Mary Whitfield's descendants continued to champion schools, libraries, and community programs, expanding access to knowledge and opportunity. Whitfield children and grandchildren attended high schools, colleges, and universities, entering professional fields from law and medicine to engineering and teaching. The family emphasized that prosperity, while desirable, was incomplete without ethical responsibility, social contribution, and intellectual growth. The 1950s also brought cultural shifts. Television, cinema, and popular music transformed social life, influencing youth and communities. Whitfield families participated actively, balancing engagement with awareness of enduring principles. Discussions of literature, history, and ethics persisted in family gatherings, ensuring that cultural curiosity was anchored in moral reflection. Summer visits to the orchard became not only a practical labor exercise, but also a forum for intergenerational dialogue about responsibility, citizenship, and values. Economic prosperity allowed the Whitfields to diversify. Some invested in urban businesses, others expanded farms, and some explored technological or industrial opportunities. The family's experience with previous economic downturns, wars, and industrial transitions provided wisdom for prudent investment and strategic growth. Ohio farms expanded into cooperative ventures. Massachusetts orchards created new cider and preserves markets, and urban relatives engaged in small enterprises, reflecting adaptability and foresight. Global awareness expanded during this period. The Cold War began, and American foreign policy focused on rebuilding Europe through the Marshall Plan, as well as addressing the emerging tensions with the Soviet Union. Whitfields, who served in post-war occupations, or engaged in international trade, witnessed the impact of American prosperity and responsibility abroad. Letters and journals reflected pride, concern, and a keen awareness that the nation's power carried both opportunity and obligation. Social change continued domestically. Civil rights movements began to gather momentum, advocating equality and justice. Whitfield families discussed these issues openly, drawing on the moral and civic lessons of previous generations. Education, community involvement, and ethical reflection remained central, ensuring that prosperity was coupled with responsibility and awareness of the broader social landscape. By 1960, the Whitfields had become emblematic of post-war American families. Prosperous, connected, educated, and morally grounded. Farms, orchards, and businesses thrived, but so did civic engagement, education, and cultural participation. The orchard in Massachusetts continued to bear fruit, serving as both literal sustenance and a symbolic anchor, reminding all generations that roots, labor, and ethical guidance were timeless sources of strength. The nation itself had transformed. Suburbs, highways, industrial growth, and consumer culture defined daily life. While global engagement and social awareness expanded responsibilities, the Whitfields navigated these changes with a blend of tradition and innovation, recognizing that prosperity alone was insufficient. Wisdom, courage, and moral clarity were essential to sustain family, community, and nation. As the decade closed, the Whitfields stood ready to embrace the turbulent 1960s. They had endured revolution, civil war, industrialization, economic depression, global conflict, and social transformation. Their principles, courage, conscience, labor, and unity remained steadfast. The orchard, enduring and resilient, symbolized continuity and hope, a reminder that heritage, hard work, and moral responsibility could guide every generation through challenge and opportunity alike. Legacy and continuity, 1960 present. The 1960s arrived as a period of promise and upheaval. America was booming economically, yet social and political transformations created both excitement and tension. The Whitfields, rooted in Massachusetts, Ohio, Missouri, and beyond, navigated this rapidly changing world with a combination of inherited wisdom and adaptive vision. They were heirs not just to orchards and farms, but to centuries of resilience, moral courage, and commitment to family and community. Massachusetts' Whitfield orchard remained the heart of the family, a living testament to generations who had tilled, nurtured, and protected it. Modern technology had improved yields, but tradition still guided practice. Young Whitfields learned to graft trees, press cider, and respect the cycles of the land. The orchard became more than a business. It was a place of education, reflection, and reunion. Every season, summer harvests brought together cousins, uncles, aunts, and grandparents to teach labor, ethical responsibility, and family history. Ohio farms and Missouri enterprises reflected similar balance between innovation and heritage. Mechanized tools and modern techniques allowed for efficiency, while the enduring values of cooperation, integrity, and civic engagement guided business decisions. The Whitfields had learned from prior challenges, economic depressions, world wars, industrialization, that adaptability must be paired with principle. These lessons were now crucial as America entered the complexities of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The family witnessed and participated in social transformation. The civil rights movement reshaped cities and towns. Women's rights, environmental awareness, and political activism expanded opportunities and responsibilities. Whitfields engaged in education, advocacy, and public service. Mary Whitfield's lineage continued to establish schools, libraries, and community programs, while others pursued careers in law, medicine, engineering, and technology. Across generations, the family emphasized that opportunity without ethical guidance was incomplete. Echoing centuries of accumulated wisdom, technological advancement accelerated. Computers, telecommunications, and the internet transformed work, communication, and culture. Whitfields and urban centers embraced these innovations while maintaining ties to tradition. Letters and emails now coexisted, connecting family branches across continents. Business operations integrated modern logistics, yet principles of prudence, honesty, and diligence remained foundational. The Whitfields demonstrated that adaptation did not require abandoning heritage, rather it demanded integrating past lessons into contemporary practice. Economic diversification became central to sustaining the family legacy. Massachusetts orchards introduced organic produce and artisanal products. Ohio farms engaged in agribusiness partnerships and community-supported agriculture. Urban Whitfields pursued entrepreneurship in finance, technology, and education. By combining innovation with tradition, the family ensured not only prosperity but continuity, honoring centuries of labor and moral guidance. Community engagement remained core to Whitfield's identity. Volunteer programs, local governance, and education initiatives reflected a commitment to service rooted in the family's history. The legacy of resilience, cultivated through revolution, civil war, industrial growth, depression, and world conflict, informed these actions. The family understood that prosperity alone could not sustain society. Active participation and ethical guidance were necessary for lasting impact. Cultural and historical preservation became a priority. Whitfields documented family history, archived letters, photographs, and records from centuries past. Summer gatherings at the orchard featured storytelling, history lessons, and demonstrations of traditional skills, ensuring younger generations understood their heritage. These acts reinforced a sense of identity and continuity, bridging the past with the challenges and opportunities of contemporary America. By the late 20th century, the Whitfields had become emblematic of multi-generational resilience. They had witnessed colonial America, revolution, civil war, industrialization, global conflict, economic depression, and rapid modernization. Across all these epochs, core principles, courage, conscience, labor, and unity guided the family. These values were not static. They were interpreted and applied differently by each generation, but the essence endured. In the 21st century, the Whitfields faced new challenges: globalization, environmental concerns, technological disruption, and social change. Yet they met these challenges with the same principles that had sustained ancestors for centuries. Massachusetts orchards integrated sustainable practices. Ohio farms explored renewable energy, and urban Whitfields engaged in civic leadership, philanthropy, and innovation. The family's adaptability was grounded in the knowledge that history provides both lessons and inspiration for navigating uncertainty. The orchard, enduring and fertile, remained the ultimate symbol of continuity. Its roots, deep in soil cultivated over centuries, represented the family's steadfast principles. Its branches reaching skyward symbolized growth, aspiration, and the potential of each generation. The Whitfields, tending the land, nurturing relationships, and engaging in civic life, honored their ancestors while preparing the next generation to face an ever-changing world. The story of the Whitfields is, in many ways, the story of America itself, a journey of exploration, struggle, innovation, and adaptation. Each generation faced its own trials, from revolution and civil war to economic upheaval and global conflict. Each generation learned that resilience required labor, courage required moral clarity, and prosperity required community engagement. These lessons, passed down through centuries, ensured that the Whitfields remained anchored, even as the world changed around them. As the present day unfolds, the Whitfields continue to navigate life with foresight, courage, and ethical responsibility. They honor a legacy built over centuries, understanding that the strength of a family and a nation lies not only in wealth or technology, but in character, conscience, and the enduring bonds of community and family. The orchard still flourishes. Massachusetts skies still witness seasonal harvests and the values that guided Nathaniel, Samuel, Thomas, Mary, Caleb, and generations beyond continue to shape lives, reminding all that history, labor, and integrity are timeless pillars upon which both family and nation endure. In the end, the Whitfields' journey across centuries, states, and challenges demonstrates that legacy is not inherited solely through property or name, but through principles, stories, and actions. The past informs the present shapes the future, and through every change, every trial, and every triumph, the Whitfields have remained steadfast, a living testament to the enduring power of family, labor, and moral clarity.